transport networks.
Thank you. The next item of business is a debate on motion number 4594 in the name of Joanne Lamont on the future of Scotland. Members who wish to take part in the debate should press the request to speak button now. And I call on Joanne Lamont to speak to move the motion. Ms Lamont, you've got 14 minutes.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. And may I, in moving Labour's motion today, emphasise that we have brought forward this debate precisely because we have respect for this Parliament and its role in holding the Government to account, and our expectation that Government seeks not to finesse questions but confronts them and answers them. Presiding Officer, all of us in this Parliament, in this country, are entitled to our own opinions. What we are not entitled to is our own facts. We called for this debate this week because nothing about what the First Minister and his Deputy told us last week about Scotland's future in Europe is satisfactory. They tried to convince us, not saying to us that this was their opinion, but they came to this chamber and revealed that for months, possibly years, they have been trying to convince us with their own facts without ever establishing them. Before last Tuesday, the First Minister was on the record as saying that he had sought advice from Scotland's law officers on what was Scotland's status regarding the European Union if we choose to leave the United Kingdom. He said it, he often implied it, he even went to court to keep that legal advice secret. And then the dam burst when the Deputy First Minister told the Chamber that the advice he was seeking to keep private did not, in fact, exist. You could not make it up. What followed was a week of contradictions and contortions, smokescreen and bluster, reference to opaque rules and baseless assertions. The only thing that is clear about this sorry mess is that the people of Scotland cannot expect the First Minister to be honest with them when it comes to fulfilling his lifelong dream of breaking up the United Kingdom. The people of Scotland can no longer trust their First Minister to tell them the truth. Why is this debate important? Because the people of Scotland deserve to know what the consequence will be if they vote yes in 2014. Will we still be a member of the European Union? Will we have to adopt the euro as our currency and all that goes with that? Will a border have to be erected between Scotland and England? The First Minister doesn't try to find the true answers to these questions. He starts with the answer he wants and then works backwards from there, whatever the truth. Last week, he boldly proclaimed to the Chamber again that, yes, of course, an independent Scotland will be a member of the European Union. That was backed up by his loyal deputy, whose spokesperson told the media last week the cast-iron position is that an independent Scotland will retain the pound. We have heard these assertions many times before, but this was the first time they had been repeated since Scotland finally found out they had not bothered in 5 years of government to gain any legal advice to determine if their grand plan had any basis in reality at all. What basis do they have for these claims? It would seem simply because that is what they want to happen. Last week, the First Minister cited once again Lord Mackenzie Stewart, a fine man, I am sure, and a very successful judge. But we all seem to have to go on is a throwaway line he gave to Scotland on Sunday 20 years ago. Rather than offering unequivocal advice, he merely says he is, quote, puzzled at the suggestion. And this was before the European Union was formed, before the single currency, and significantly before the Treaty of Lisbon, which allowed for the first time countries to leave the EU. Alex Salmond then backs this up with the words of Eamon Gallagher, another fine man, I am sure, but he was also a member of the SNP branch in Brussels. I am sure the opinions of these men are relevant, if slightly dated, and add to the debate. But to hold them as definitive, while at the same time ignoring the views of José Manuel Barroso, the President of the EU Commission, and José Manuel García Margallo, the Spanish Foreign Minister, is complete nonsense. This form of selective hearing exemplifies the hollowness of the nationalist position, because deep down to them, none of this matters. All of these consequences, should they come to pass, will be worth it as long as they have what they view as self-determination, and if only we can go over the line of the referendum. All else is grist to the mill.
She uses the word definitive, and I just wonder if she would accept that actually we are not in definitive territory here. We're not even really in legal territory here. Because all of these things, would she accept... Would she accept that all of these things are subject to negotiation, so that all of this we are going into in negotiation and the lawyers cannot give us definite positions?
Joanne Lamont.
I'm sure when the First Minister has that relayed to him, he'll wish he'd come himself to defend his own position. Because the First Minister didn't say, oh, well, it's all subject to the lawyers. He said, we will be in Europe and we will have sterling. None of that has been proven. That's why we have a First Minister, all grist to the mill, and that's why we have a First Minister who gets his advisers to write letters for referendum experts and cites them in the chamber before they've agreed to sign. That is why he even offered to extend his penmanship to the Trump to get his backing over the release of McGrahy. That is why we have a First Minister who proudly announced investment from the Korean company Doosan, but when they pulled out, he claimed it wasn't his place to tell people, even though he had included Doosan in budget documents voted on by this Parliament. That is why we have a First Minister who lobbied the UK Government on behalf of his favourite discredited newspaper proprietor Rupert Murdoch, claiming it was good for Scottish jobs, yet is still unable to provide a single shred of evidence to back this up. Last week wasn't a one-off. It was a pattern of behaviour that the people of Scotland are getting sick of, and so are many in his own party. In NATO, but somehow no nuclear weapons. Keeping the pound and a place in the Monetary Policy Committee, but no restrictions on borrowing. And in the EU, but no euro. Today, I'm calling for the First Minister to bring to an end to the assertions and the boasts. If he comes forward now with the true position of an independent Scotland, questions over his character will disappear, and this Parliament and the people we represent can have a real debate. In 2 years, the people of Scotland will come together to decide our future.
I'm very grateful.
Sorry, Patrick Harvey.
Thank you. I'm grateful to Joanne Lamont for giving way. Last week, we both gave evidence to the House of Lords Committee on Economic Affairs about many of these issues, and I seem to remember Joanne Lamont saying that she respected the fact that I'd been honest in acknowledging areas of doubt and uncertainty that both the yes and no sides of this debate have to engage with. The Labour Party, as well as the SNP, are responsible for the tone of this debate. Can she guarantee that if Alex Salmond and the SNP stop pretending to have cast-iron guarantees, she'll stop demanding cast-iron guarantees on issues which are subject to negotiation after the vote?
Joanne Lamont.
I think, as I said last week, both to the House of Lords Committee and in this chamber, we owe it to the people of Scotland to scrutinise the proposition that's been put forward so the people of Scotland can make the decision with full knowledge. And all the evidence thus far from the First Minister and the Deputy is they simply think that assertion is enough. And that is demeaning this debate, and it's demeaning this Parliament, and it's denying the people of this country the opportunity that they require. And I do make that commitment, that because, precisely as I've said, in 2 years the people of Scotland will come together to decide our future. It will be a historic moment, and our fellow citizens deserve to know exactly what they're going to vote for. Trust is key to this debate, because the day after the referendum, we will need to come together to unite behind that result. As First Minister of Scotland's Government and the leader of the chief proponents of one of the two options on the ballot, Alex Salmond has a responsibility to ensure we have an honest and open debate. We cannot do that in this climate, where any concern or question is explained away and every debate closed down. And what does the First Minister mean when he uses the term debate? Can his definition of it restore any of our trust? Let's remember what the TV presenter Andrew Neil asked him on 4th March. The First Minister was asked if he had, and I quote, sought advice from your own law officers. His answer was, and again, I quote, we have, yes. And what words does he then use, which he now claims change we have, yes, into the truth, no, we haven't. The words he believes produce the magic transition are in terms of the debate. So when does yes mean no? in Alex Salmond's world when you're having a debate? What chance do we have of an honest debate when we have a First Minister who believes that? It's time that the SNP had the courage of their convictions, laid out their case, backed by real facts and real evidence, and for better or worse, let the people decide. And there have been authoritative statements from the European Commission which may not fit with the SNP's argument, but which are clear and straightforward. If I may, let me quote this. In response to a question tabled by a Lunid Morgan MEP in 2004, the Commission replied, "When a part of the territory of a member state ceases to be part of the state, for example because the territory becomes an independent state, the treaties will no longer apply to that territory." In other words, a new independent region would, by the fact of its independence, become a third country with respect to the Union, and the treaties would, from the day of its independence, not apply anymore on its territory. The Commission explained further that the new state could apply for membership. The Commission explained further that the new state could apply for membership, but for the application to be accepted, it would require the unanimous agreement of member states. And Mr Neil wants a debate. He actually has to listen to it, as well as shouting from a secondary position. The Commission confirmed that position on 11 September 2009. I'd like to make some progress. The Commission confirmed that position on 11 September 2009, saying that the application, quote, would have to go through every country's parliament. One can legitimately expect the Spanish politicians in Madrid would want Scotland to have a bumpy ride. The notion that Scotland becoming a member state is seamless is highly optimistic. I know these opinions from the Commission to be authentic, and so too does the man I was quoting, the former Deputy Leader of the SNP, Jim Sillars. If the SNP won't listen to me, then they should surely listen to one of their own. Jim Sillars went on, "It is the Commission, the body with the political power, not any private person, however exalted in the legal world, which is the decisive voice." He added, "On this core EU issue of importance not just to the business community, but to the people who work for it, we have had a demonstration of amateurism and, along with it, thanks to the bungled FOI request, a loss of trust." So what is to be done when there has been, in the former Deputy Leader of SNP's words, such a devastating loss of trust? Well, what will not restore trust is the humiliating sight of the First Minister hiding behind a ministerial code, hand-picking a new judge to look into this case, refusing to look at the substance of the scandal, and then crowing, "It's okay, these guys have never found me guilty so far." This isn't about his future. It is about the future of Scotland, and Scotland deserves better. That is why today I am calling for a judicial inquiry into the First Minister's handling of this affair from the beginning. An inquiry into the basis upon which did the First Minister ever assert that Scotland would automatically be a member of the EU, what made him say that this separate Scotland would not have to adopt the euro, an inquiry into why he has said he had sought advice from the law officers when he had not. No amount of bluff and bluster will stop us seeking the truth. He cannot hide behind the Section 30 order he signed with the Prime Minister because, as he made clear when it was first offered, he didn't think he needed one. Indeed, in fact, when the offer of a Section 30 was first made, the First Minister told the UK Government to butt out. We need to restore the public's confidence in the way we do politics. And if the First Minister doesn't care about that, if his Cabinet colleagues are too frightened to challenge him, and his backbenchers don't worry about burning their credibility in TV and radio stations up and down the country, then we in the Scottish Labour Party will take action to restore confidence in our political system. And I finish on this point. In June 2004, Alex Salmond was asked if he would stand against the leadership of his party. He said then, "If nominated, I'll decline, if drafted, I'll defer, and if elected, I'll resign." Well, he didn't decline, he didn't defer, but if he does not take the urgent action I have outlined, if he doesn't apologise to people of Scotland for misleading them on this and so many other vital issues, then perhaps that third option will be taken from him.
I now call on Nicola Sturgeon to speak to move amendment number 4594.3 Deputy First Minister, you've got 10 minutes.
Presiding Officer, I think Joanne Lamont has demonstrated again today that as long as Labour continues to struggle so badly with the responsibilities of opposition, it will not be judged to be fit for government by the people of this country. The future of Scotland is always a worthy debate for this Parliament. It's also a subject that all of us, inside and outside of this chamber, will consider over the next 2 years as we approach the most significant democratic event in our long history as a nation. This government has an ambitious vision for Scotland as a prosperous and successful country reflecting values of fairness and opportunity, equality and social cohesion. How to achieve that kind of society is what we should be talking about in a debate entitled Scotland's Future. But of course, the motion for today's debate is not really about Scotland's future. It doesn't address our place in the world as an independent nation. It's not about Labour's vision for our country, if indeed they have one, something which is increasingly open to doubt. And it fails to address the very real risks to Scotland that a no vote in 2014 would present. For example, it fails to even mention the virtual and depressing certainty that Trident and its successors will be based on the Clyde for another 50 years if Scotland does not become independent. And shamefully, Presiding Officer, shamefully, for a motion supposedly about Scotland's future, it doesn't even consider the disgraceful welfare reforms of the UK government that will impoverish so many of our most vulnerable citizens. These are the issues that I think people in Scotland would expect an opposition worthy of the name to be debating in this chamber. But the motion today is not about any of these issues that affect the lives of people in our country. Instead of that, it is a desperate attempt by Labour to simply rerun last Thursday's FMQs when the Leader of the Opposition first had the opportunity to substantiate the claims she makes again today. The fact is, Presiding Officer, she failed to do so then, and she has failed to do so, albeit at greater length, today. Yes.
McIntosh.
Can I ask the Deputy First Minister whether she believes whether Scots use the euro or the pound is a matter which affects the everyday lives of every single Scot living in this country?
Deputy First Minister.
Yes, I do. And I would refer the member to the example of Sweden, which is in the European Union and doesn't use the euro because the people of Sweden have decided not to. But, Presiding Officer, contrary to the motion before us today, there is no contradiction between the statements made by the First Minister and I last week. Our statements on the 23rd and the 25th of October made the position perfectly clear. But I'm more than happy to set out that position again today for the benefit of those in the opposition benches. The Scottish Government has published a number of papers on constitutional matters since 2007. These documents set out our view that an independent Scotland would continue in membership of the European Union. We have consistently quoted the views of a number of eminent legal authorities in support of that position. Joanne Lamont may decide to dismiss them, but I think all of them can claim or can have claimed to have known more about these matters than perhaps Joanne Lamont does. Further, as the extract from our documents show, we have also been clear that negotiations will be required about the terms of Scottish membership of the EU. And as the First Minister has said, these documents were underpinned by law officers' advice in exactly the way that has been set out by the Lord Advocate in a letter today to Ruth Davidson and published in Spice for every single member of this chamber to scrutinise. However, Presiding Officer, as I outlined in my statement to Parliament last week, the Government's judgment is that the time is now right to seek an opinion from law officers on the specific question of an independent Scotland's continuing membership of the EU. And the reason we've chosen to do so now is worth repeating. As recent comments from the European Commission have made clear, the basis on which Scotland becomes independent is a highly relevant factor. The Edinburgh Agreement confirms that the UK Government will respect the legality of the referendum and its outcome, and that both governments will work together in light of that outcome. So that provides a clear basis on which Scottish law officers can consider a specific scenario and apply the relevant legal principles.
Will there any?
I thank the Deputy First Minister for giving way. Can she remark on the comments from my colleague Michael Moore last week, who said there was nothing that prevented the government from seeking legal advice before the Edinburgh Agreement?
Deputy First Minister.
But clearly the legal advice you get after the Edinburgh Agreement that sets out the process for independence is going to be a lot more meaningful than legal advice you get before that event. That is the point. Presiding Officer, I want to turn now to the convention that ministers don't confirm the fact or content of legal advice in law offices. I'll take an intervention. Right.
John Lamont.
To repeat the point, in January, your government said that the actions of the UK government in offering you the powers were not necessary. So why would you not have taken advice on these questions when you didn't need the context of the UK government to determine your position?
Deputy First Minister.
Constructive and putting the legality of the referendum beyond doubt, we chose to enter into these negotiations with the UK government. That was something I think that all of the opposition parties actually called on us to do back then. Presiding Officer, I want to turn now to the convention that ministers don't confirm the fact or content of legal advice from the law officers. A convention that is well established and followed by successive governments. Is also enshrined in ministerial codes for both the Scottish and UK governments. UK and Scottish FOI legislation also provide mechanisms which are used to protect legal advice both from law officers and others. And it was in the interest of upholding our interpretation of the relevant provisions of the FOI Act that we made the decision to appeal the ruling of the Commissioner. That was, I believe, entirely appropriate at that time. And we are not the first government to consider that such action is appropriate. I would refer members to the case of Her Majesty's Treasury versus the Information Commissioner, where the last Labour UK government took a case against the Information Commissioner to the High Court in England to uphold that very position. Incidentally, they won that case in the High Court. However, Presiding Officer, circumstances did change as a result of my decision to seek the permission of the Lord Advocate to tell Parliament that I had requested specific advice, and in these changed circumstances we don't consider it appropriate to continue with that appeal. But the principle involved in that appeal has not been conceded. We remain of the view that the protection provided in the legislation is important, and the differing interpretations of the law on the part of the Government and the Commissioner will require to be resolved at a later stage. Presiding Officer, the Government is therefore very clear that it has acted properly at all times. Nevertheless, the First Minister was asked to investigate possible breaches of the Code, and he's invited Sir David Bell, a distinguished public servant, to investigate this complaint independently. I suggest we all now allow Sir David to proceed with his investigation, and I call on all sides of this chamber to do the right thing and respect his findings when those findings are published.
Jackson Carlo.
I'm grateful to the Deputy First Minister for giving way. Can she tell me where in the Ministerial Code or in the letter from Frank Mulholland to Ruth Davidson today it says that ministers are not allowed to confirm that they have sought legal advice?
This is set out in the letter, but the Ministerial Code says that we are not permitted to confirm the existence or the content of advice from the law officers. And I would refer the member to the letter sent to Ruth Davidson by the Lord Advocate earlier today. I'm going to make progress in the final minute or so that I've got available. I have now set out very clearly the response of the Government to what I consider to be the baseless allegations in the Labour motion today. Let me now, in the time remaining though, turn to the actual future of Scotland and consider the crucial subject of an independent Scotland's place in Europe. As I set out earlier, our publications have consistently said that, in our view, an independent Scotland would continue in the European Union. We set out a range of opinions that support that position. Let me also quote Graham Avery of Oxford University, a senior advisor at the European Policy Centre in Brussels, Honorary Director General of the European Commission. He said this to the Westminster Foreign Affairs Committee: "For practical and political reasons, the idea of Scotland leaving the EU and subsequently applying to join it is not feasible. From the practical point of view, it would require complicated temporary arrangements for a new relationship between the EU and Scotland. Neither the EU nor Scotland would have any interest in creating such an anomaly. So I think the position that we have cited is clear. But, Presiding Officer, as John Mason rightly said, this is not simply a legal question. It's also a matter of policy and of politics. And this is where the arguments of the opposition are particularly and completely incredible. The notion that oil-rich, renewable energy-rich, fishing-rich Scotland would not be a member of the European Union and one welcomed with open arms is, to my mind, patently absurd, and it is time for the debate about Scotland's future to stop dealing in opposition absurdities. Presiding Officer, this government will make the positive case for Scotland's future as an independent nation. We will set out our ambitious vision for Scotland as a prosperous and successful European country. We will argue that independence will enable Scotland to be a country fit for the 21st century. We will show that independence is right for Scotland because it is the only way to realise that vision and to deliver a better and fairer society for the people of our country. And I am confident that our vision for Scotland will win the argument and deliver a yes vote in 2014. I move the amendment in my name.
I now call on Ruth Davidson to speak to and move amendment number 4594.1. Ms Davidson, you've got 7 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. It seems to me that creating a new nation state, such as an independent Scotland, is a matter of trust. You have to trust that those that are proposing the creation or transition of that state to safeguard 3 things. Firstly, to safeguard national security, because the primary responsibility of government is the defence of its people and the military structure which provides it. To safeguard its economic security by establishing its central bank, currency and regulatory regime. And to safeguard its political security by establishing that nation-state's place in the world through membership of international organisations like the EU. People need to trust that the proposals for each of these pillars of nationhood are sound. Assertion number 1. We've already had this Deputy First Minister assert on live television that an independent Scotland would have a seat on the Monetary Policy Board of the Bank of England, only to backtrack later after she finds out that's not the case. Assertion number 2. This SNP government has also asserted that an independent Scotland would share both a regulator and a lender of last resort with the rest of the UK, only to be gently reminded that all EU countries have their own regulator and that there is no agreement that the Bank of England would support a future independent Scotland. So much for being able to trust the economic pillar. Assertion number 3. On defence, we have blind assertion that an independent Scotland could automatically assume membership of NATO with its first strike nuclear policy, while simultaneously removing nuclear weapons from its territory. That is an assertion seemingly based on no evidence or advice, and I would ask the Deputy First Minister to tell the Chamber what discussions have taken place with NATO to assure the people of Scotland that this is indeed the case. And I would take an intervention on that point now if she would care to give it. Otherwise, once again, the SNP are playing fast and loose, using assertion rather than fact, and the trust of that first pillar, the pillar of defence, also falls. Now, that's some record before we even get to the events of last week. The Labour leader today has already outlined the timeline, which has seen ministers from this government assert and assert and assert as fact something where the answer is unknown. They don't know whether Scots would be spending pounds or euros. They don't know whether farmers would continue getting European support. They don't know whether the Schengen Agreement would alter our border controls. And this Deputy First Minister told this Chamber on Tuesday that they haven't asked for law officers' advice, despite the First Minister claiming on television that advice had been sought, and despite countless experts, 2 European Commission chairmen and the Spanish Foreign Minister on record saying the opposite is true. I'll give way to the member.
Mark MacDonald.
Can the member advise, does she think the UK will be in or out of the EU any time in the next 5 or 10 years?
Ruth Davidson.
Well, I know the current structure under which we are a member, and I know that the current position is that we will stay a member. I am not asserting as fact anything which I do not know to be true. And if we turn to today's reports, in El Pais newspaper, we have the Commission's Vice President, the Commissioner for Justice, Viviane Reding, making the situation in Catalonia very clear. That Catalonia would be considered a new state. It would have to apply for membership under the provisions of Article 49 of the EU Treaty and would need unanimous approval to be admitted. And we can assume, as for Catalonia, so goes Scotland. So, despite not knowing the European position, the assertions from the SNP have continued today. But we've also had their supposed answer on how to clear up this mess of their own making. It's for the First Minister to refer himself to see if he broke the ministerial code. So let's look at this system. Alex Salmond is referring himself to Sir David Bell, a man appointed by the First Minister to be investigated under terms of reference decided by the First Minister, and the rest of the panel, Lord Fraser and Ailish Angelini, are apparently surplus to requirements on this one. It is one thing to appoint the judge, but to dismiss the jury and to choose the charges on an issue which is entirely about trust raises eyebrows in the extreme. And what about the waste of public money? Of a government spending taxpayers' money in court to keep secret advice they now say they never had in the first place? On Tuesday, the Deputy First Minister said she'd update this Parliament on how much was spent after the £3,000 figure she quoted turned out to be an incomplete figure. When can we expect that update? Also, when can we be told who in the civil service sanctioned the use of this cash and when to fight to keep secret non-existent advice? And indeed, when legal sources close to the First Minister are telling the national press that Scotland's law officers consistently told Alex Salmond's government that an independent Scotland's future inside the European Union was not automatic and would require detailed negotiations, we need to know whether that's true. Of course, the person that could clear this up is the Lord Advocate himself, Frank Mulholland, who has written to me today to say that he has no intention of appearing before this Parliament to answer legitimate questions and to clarify this issue. I'll give way.
The member will know that the Advocate General, the UK law officer relevant to this matter, has made his view clear that the likely consequence of Scotland leaving the United Kingdom is that Scotland would have to apply to join the European Union. Does she not find it passing strange that we can know the opinion of the Advocate General, but we are denied the opinion of the Lord Advocate?
Ruth Davidson? I do indeed find it strange, and I also refer to 4.5.2 of the Standing Orders to show that there is no impediment for the law officer coming here. Now, I'm going to advance because I'm very close to my time. A referendum isn't an election where the results can be reversed in 5 years. The people of Scotland are being asked to make a decision that could affect our nation forever. They need and deserve the fullest possible information about what independence means to make that choice. It is simply not good enough for Scotland's government to assert as fact that which is not, and to go to court to deny information to Scotland's people, which the Information Commissioner decides is in the public's interests to know. The people of Scotland need the truth, and where there is only opinion, even legal opinion, they need to know that for what it is too. Scotland deserves to have a government that people can trust. And I'm not sure that Alex Salmond's referral on the ministerial code will restore any of the trust that's just been lost. I'm pleased to move the amendment in my name.
I now call on Willie Rennie to speak to move amendment number 4594.2. Mr Rennie, you've got 7 minutes.
The north-south walk from the tip of Scotland to the bottom of Scotland is an opportunity for tourism and for economic growth. That is true. Today's debate, however, is about the matter of the First Minister's word. He should be here today responding to these claims. I want to move the amendment in my name, but before I go further, I want to this is a matter about confidence, and about confidence in the First Minister, and it was shattered last week, not just really because of the contradiction between what the Deputy First Minister had said last week and what the First Minister had said in March earlier on this year, but because they continue to say that those two statements are not contradictory. It's not possible for both what Nicola Sturgeon said and what Alex Salmond said to both be right. I've tried to understand what it's about. I've tried to put myself in the position of the Deputy First Minister and the First Minister in their desperate attempts. On the 13th of September, the First Minister said, and he said in response to a question from me, Willie Rennie seems to be doubting the legal advice before it's even published. What exactly did he mean? Did he mean doubting the legal advice in the terms of the debate that underpinned all government documents that have ever been published in the last 6 years? Or the legal advice that he went to court to keep secret, wasting taxpayers' money, fighting the Information Commissioner, even though it didn't actually exist? This is nonsense, and these members know it's nonsense. On the issue of the Labour Party's proposal on a judicial inquiry, I would think the Scottish Government should welcome this. The present situation is bad for Scotland. Confidence in what ministers say to us has been shattered. Two ministers said the opposite things. They can't both be right. Scrutiny from a judge would allow the Scottish Government to regain some trust. So I support the Labour Party's proposal. But what is yet more significant is that last week's statement means for the wider debate on an independent Scotland's membership of the European Union. The SNP expect us to believe that their assertions, but by their own admission, they've just been guessing. They didn't have the legal advice on which to underpin their assertions. They have just been guessing about Scotland's continuing membership of the European Union. And it's so important. It's not just like any other piece of legislation which you can repeal. There is no going back. Once you become independent, there's no turning back. You are gone. You are separate. So people shouldn't have to guess about the terms of being a member of the European Union. It's not as if Scotland wouldn't be. There's no doubt that an independent Scotland would be. I'm not denying that. It's the term... I see. But it's the terms of the debate. It's the terms of being a member of the European Union. And the terms could be significant. We are just into a big guessing game just now. And we can't just simply rely on the guesses. If the SNP are wrong about their assertions that we become an automatic member of the European Union, it could be extremely significant. Automatic member. The members should listen very carefully. An automatic member of the European Union. You would have to, perhaps, like any other member, new member of the European Union, you'd have to join the euro. You'd also have to join the Fiscal Stability Pact. That means the Scottish deficit would have to be reduced from 7.2%. The members should listen, because they might learn something. 7.2% of GDP down to 3% of GDP. That's £5 billion off the budget, or £5 billion on taxes. That's £1,000 for every man, woman and child in Scotland. That could be the price to pay. No. The SNP...
Members not giving way, Mr.
The SNP say they want Scotland to decide our future by ourselves. But the SNP want an independent Scotland to be forced with this choice of keeping the pound under the control of a foreign UK government or adopting the euro, costing us billions. Alex Salmond wants Scotland to choose between a pound rock and a euro hard place. That's just the country. If you look at Schengen and the rebate, there is so much more that's under question here. So we can't let them off the hook. They want a decision to end a country, a permanent act. Those who are advocating this change need to set out the legal basis, and that's got to be shared. We can't just convince the Cabinet, because I suspect they're already convinced about Scottish independence. They also have to convince all 27 cabinets across the European Union. Nicola Sturgeon was right. This is not just an issue about the legalities. This is also an issue about politics, domestic politics of countries across the European Union. The Spanish Foreign Minister, as we've all heard last week, he was casting doubt on the automatic membership, saying you'd have to go to the end of the queue. We've heard today about another Spanish intervention. Domestic Spanish politics has a direct impact on our politics, and those who ignore that are ignoring the realities of the debate. We cannot simply wait for the Spanish veto in 2015. No. 2015. We cannot simply wait for that veto. We've got to know now. And that's why the Scottish Government needs to start to publish the basis of the legal evidence. It also needs to get and show that the rest of the European Union, all 27 members of the European Union, agree with that basis. We can't just simply guess on the basis that the SNP are right in every single assertion that they make. This is too important, that we cannot turn back if we go for an independent Scotland. We need to know now. Otherwise, you are expecting Scots to go into the dark, to take a step into the dark and vote in the referendum without the knowledge of what that dark means. The First Minister and the Deputy First Minister cannot both be right. Their complicated explanations have assured and reassured no one. The public know that they have been caught out. They need to come clean on that. And secondly, there is significant doubt about what the SNP tell us. So therefore, the level of proof that they require is significantly higher now. This means that they have to show us the legal basis of joining the European Union, the terms of joining the European Union, and they need to show that all members of the European Union, all the countries, all 27 countries, agree with them. Without that, people will have very much doubt about what the SNP tell us.
I now call on Aileen MacLeod to be followed by Jackie Bailey.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. It is depressingly predictable that the Labour Party has opted to table a motion in this Parliament on a subject about which the Scottish Government has already responded with two comprehensive statements to this Parliament. As the Scottish Government has made clear in both its statements, it has chosen formally to seek legal advice now because the Edinburgh Agreement makes clear the context in which an independent Scotland will be established. And that context matters in that we now expect the former UK Government to wholly endorse the position that Scots vote for in 2014, including their right to remain part of the EU. So let there be no doubt, under an SNP government, an independent Scotland will take its place at the EU's top table as a full and constructive member state, ready and willing to play its part in helping to tackle the major challenges that the EU collectively faces at what is an unprecedented juncture. Presiding Officer, no one takes seriously the proposition that the EU will try... I'm coming to you later, Mr Rennie. Presiding Officer, no one takes seriously the proposition that the EU will try to expel Scotland following the 2014 referendum. There is simply no provision under EU law to do so. Put simply, Scottish citizens and their membership of the EU are protected by EU law, not threatened by it. In any event, why would anyone in the EU even contemplate such a move? I mean, Scotland has been inside the EU for 40 years. We already comply with all necessary EU legislation. We are a major market for exports and investment from the other EU member states, and thousands of nationals from the other 26 countries have settled in Scotland and contribute to our economy, as our nationals do in the economies of the other member states. And Scotland has unparalleled renewable energy resources in the European Union. Presiding Officer, I think given all the continuing nonsense that we've had today on the back of the continuing hysteria and hysterics from last week, I think now it's time to put on the record some facts. And we need to try and move the debate beyond the process and to focus on the substantive issue of Scotland's membership in the EU. Now, our universities are among the best in the world, and our scientists contribute substantially to joint EU research projects. Are we supposed to take seriously the scaremongering claims that this Scotland will be unwelcome in the EU? That is simply ludicrous. So the SNP's message is clear and unambiguous. Scotland's future inside the EU is safe with this government. But can our opponents say the same? Can those on the Tory, Labour and Liberal Democrat benches give the same unambiguous promise to Scotland's voters? her businesses, her workers, whose livelihoods depend on access to the EU internal market? I doubt it, because what we see in Westminster are all three political parties running scared of the right-wing rhetoric of the UK Independence Party, a party that many observers expect to win the 2014 European Parliament elections south of the border. And just last week, 6 Tory backbenchers tabled a bill that would result, if passed, in the UK leaving the EU, and it is perhaps only appropriate that one of the 6 is called Mark Reckless. Reckless by name, reckless by nature. Getting the UK out of the EU is no longer a minority sport. Quite the opposite. It seems quickly becoming the official policy of the Tory Lib Dem coalition, with the Labour Party, as is their way nowadays, dutifully following on behind. It now seems certain that the Tory Lib Dem coalition will bring to an end the UK's participation in the European arrest warrant, and as the Scottish Police have made clear, that will make the process of law enforcement in our country much more difficult. And in fact, the Tory Lib Dem coalition is poised to ditch 130 measures on justice cooperation with our EU partners, the majority of which are practical matters of law enforcement, and the SNP government opposes this move. But this will not bring to an end the demands from the Eurosceptic right. Under Westminster rules, Scotland's future in the EU looks increasingly uncertain, as Cameron is unwilling to face them down, and the Labour opposition sit in the wing, waiting to see what way the wind is blowing. Presiding Officer, the influence of the UK Government in EU negotiations today has reached an all-time low, and even our closest friends have given up in the face of British obstructionism and high-handed lecturing on the alleged failings of our partners. The Westminster Government is set to bring the UK out of the EU. Now, I firmly believe the majority of Scots want a future inside the EU, and to them I simply repeat the question asked earlier this year by the First Minister: do you want to be independent in Europe or isolated in Britain? Like him, I know where I'd rather be. And before closing, Presiding Officer, I want to turn to the amendment from the Liberal Democrats. They ask for assurances that an independent Scotland would not be required to join the euro. And on that question, I'd invite Mr Rennie to consult 2 legal texts, both of which are easily read and neither of which require interpretation. The first is Article 141 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the EU, and I have a copy here for Mr Rennie if you'd like to have a look at it later on. This requires that any member state seeking to adopt the euro must pass 5 tests, one of which that it has to have been in the EU's exchange rate mechanism for at least the previous 2 years. That is in the treaty, and it so enjoys the status of primary EU law, and no one disputes this. The second are the 2 Council decisions governing the operation of the exchange rate mechanism, one dating from 1997, the second from 2006. Both state that membership of the ERM is voluntary. And if you put these 2 statements together, it is crystal clear that before a member state is eligible to join the Eurozone, it has to A, have its own currency, and B, voluntarily decide to join the ERM. If it does not do so, then it is simply not eligible to join the euro, and it obviously cannot be forced to do so. This is the approach that Sweden adopted in 1995, and which it continues to adhere to, and it remains outside the euro.
The member must conclude, please.
Presiding Officer, I think it is a great shame the Labour Party is choosing to tie up the valuable time of this Parliament on an issue that has already been fully addressed by the Scottish Government. And I think people of Scotland would prefer us to be debating issues that really matter to them, such as the huge damage being done to our disadvantaged and vulnerable citizens by the Tory Lib Dem Welfare Reform Bill. I therefore urge Parliament to vote against this motion for the Labour Party and support the amendment tabled by Nicola Sturgeon.
Order. Before we move on, can I inform Parliament that it's speeches of 6 minutes. For those who take interventions, there's a little bit of time at this stage of the debate to give back time, but for those who don't, it is speeches of 6 minutes. I call Jackie Bailey, to be followed by Jamie Hepburn.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I'm not sure whether anything is indeed clearer other than I've lost almost 7 minutes of my life on that last speech. Presiding officer, it was in fact Harold Wilson who said that a week was a long time in politics. But if he was to pause and consider events in this chamber last week, I'm sure he would have judged that a day was a long time in politics for the SNP. And the events of last week are scarcely believable. We've had revelations, we've had reversals, and today we've had utter rubbish. Actually, it has all the elements of a cracking farce with the First Minister in the starring role. But it is, quite something for the actions of the First Minister to be so jaw-dropping as to eclipse the loss of two of his MSPs who were relegated to the inside pages. And all of this because of legal advice. Legal advice on whether Scotland would have automatic entry to the EU and indeed whether it would be required to join the euro. And let me tell you a story. A story of a First Minister who went to court to conceal whether he had sought legal advice and the content of that legal advice. Just imagine our surprise to discover that the First Minister was hiding the fact that he didn't have any legal advice at all. So he was wasting our money to protect something that didn't even exist. And the Deputy First Minister, who on occasion doubles as the First Minister's human shield, was sent out to explain why this was all perfectly reasonable and to tell us that she was now seeking specific legal advice from the law officers. She, of course, denied that she had sought specific legal advice from the law officers before. Shame she hadn't checked with her boss about what he'd previously said, because in that now infamous interview with Andrew Neil, when asked whether he had sought specific legal advice from his law officers, the First Minister replied, "We have, yes." Now, there is no mistaking the meaning of that, but of course, in the First Minister's fantasy world, what did we know? We were to be treated to the 27-word defence. Well, I confess, presiding officer, it was such an amazing defence, it stopped me right in my tracks. And of course, the law officers have considered the plethora of documents from the SNP, but it would appear from the Independent on Sunday that they consistently told the First Minister that Scotland's future as part of the EU would not be automatic and required detailed negotiations. Now, that must have slipped the First Minister's mind, or perhaps he couldn't reveal that for fear of breaching the Ministerial Code. So let me turn to the Ministerial Code. And the First Minister rightly defends it. But let me invite the Deputy First Minister in his place to look just a little closer at the provisions in paragraph 2.35. Now, bear in mind there are several types of legal advice. The advice from law officers is one. The advice from solicitors in the Scottish Government is two. And external legal advice is the third. So the Ministerial Code makes clear that ministers cannot reveal whether advice has been sought from the law officers. It then goes on to say that ministers cannot reveal the content of advice from law officers or other legal advice. Now, those are four very interesting words. So can the Deputy First Minister reveal whether she sought any other legal advice, but actually can't tell us what's in it? Maybe the real story here is that the SNP has sought other legal advice, but it doesn't tell you what you want to hear, so you're in complete denial. Well, here is your opportunity to clear this up. Has the Scottish Government taken any other legal advice on entry to the European Union? Feel free to intervene. Oh, well, let the record show that the Deputy First Minister didn't move a muscle. So let me ask it again, because this is important. The Ministerial Code is no bar to revealing whether legal advice was sought from other sources other than the law officers. That is absolutely clear. So will the Minister now confirm whether or not any legal advice has been sought and does indeed exist? OK, let the record also show that the Deputy First Minister didn't bother to stand up and intervene. Because, after hiding from the media the morning after her challenging Newsnight Scotland interview, she then admitted that there was an unfortunate impression created. Well, who created that impression, presiding officer? But, it wasn't their fault. So whose fault was it? Does she not understand that the anger that raged in the Scottish media on this issue is precisely because there was more, much more, than a nod and a wink on this given to so many of the commentators and journalists. The betrayal that they felt is precisely because they were told that this existed and it simply did not exist at all. Isn't it the case that the First Minister is playing fast and loose with the truth? That the legal advice that doesn't exist, according to the Deputy First Minister, seems to exist in the First Minister's mind, appears to be confirmed in the Independent on Sunday, but no, the official SNP position remains one of denial. You know, it reminds me, Presiding Officer, of the story of the Emperor's New Clothes, but the First Minister really does have no cover on this one. The serious issue underlying this is one of trust. Trust and honesty, in my view, are important traits for a politician. What I've learnt this week is that the First Minister has demonstrated neither. And this at a time when the stakes could not be higher. We are facing the most important constitutional question in over 300 years, but we now know that we cannot trust or believe what the First Minister says. And isn't it the truth that actually the First Minister will say anything and will do anything to get his way, even if it means he has to bend the facts? He has damaged his credibility, and on today's performance, he is damaging the Deputy First Minister's credibility. Let me, in closing, Presiding Officer, turn very quickly, because in the week where the First Minister has denied his own words, I don't believe the hand-picked advisers can simply consider the ministerial code, nor do I believe that the SNP majority parliament will be anything other than partisan, because that's what they've demonstrated. This is a matter for an independent judicial inquiry, and if the SNP had any respect for the people of Scotland, they would not run away from proper scrutiny.
Once again, I reiterate that there's a little bit of time for interventions, but it's up to members whether they take them or not. Jamie Hepburn, to be followed by Hugh Henry.
And of course, President Officer, the Labour Party isn't pursuing this in any partisan form at all. President Officer, I greatly regret that the Labour Party has chosen to lodge the motion before us. When I saw the subject matter, Scotland's future, I thought it promised. I thought it was going to be a genuine debate about Scotland's future. I have to say, I think this is a missed opportunity, and I think it's been very interesting to hear. We've heard from the Labour Party and others in this chamber that it's time to move beyond process and get to the substance of the debate. We've heard that time and time again, and yet they want to bring it back to process every time. Can I say, last week was, I think, a shameful episode in the Scottish body politic. We saw... you'll hear in a minute why.
Order.
The members over there will hear in a minute why it was a shameful episode, Presiding Officer, because we saw a scandalous press release from the Labour Party using the term bare-faced liar. I think the Labour Party will live to regret using that terminology, because we need to conduct this debate in proper terms, in a proper manner. And it's clear that a strategy has emerged amongst the anti-independence parties. They talk of a positive case for the union, but they know that no positive case exists. So every time they're going to play the man and not the ball. We are seeing them engaging in a spiteful, vengeful, nasty, negative name-calling campaign. We've seen some of that again. And there's one of the main proponents of it, Presiding Officer, so I'll gladly give way.
Jackie Bailey.
Can I very much thank Jamie Hepburn for giving way, and I think he's absolutely right. We shouldn't be name-calling. Does he therefore regret his comments on television that perhaps what was it, boiled cats and ate them for breakfast?
Jamie Hepburn.
Well, actually, Presiding Officer, just to clarify...
Order. To hear the member.
Just to clarify, it was actually kittens, not cats, Ms Bailey. And I think the point of that, Ms Bailey, if you've been paying attention, was actually to make the point. I was joking. When you use your terminology, you mean it. And I think it's a disgrace to the political process. Can I say our country's future should be more important in terms of this, dare I say it, catcalling style of exchange. It is a privilege, Presiding Officer, for each and every one of us to be elected to this Parliament, and that is something we would do well to remember. I think by using the terminology that was utilised last week, the Labour Party are endangering political engagement. If our political discourse becomes an exercise in name-calling, people out there are going to disengage with the process. They're going to disengage from playing their part in determining Scotland's future. So I think it's incumbent on Labour to up their game. Can I say I utterly reject the terms of Labour's motion? I think they're flogging a dead horse when it comes to the Andrew Neil interview. I heard earlier from a sedentary position from the Labour benches asking, do we have a transcript from that exchange? Yes, Presiding Officer, I do have a transcript from the exchange. The difference from the transcript that the Labour Party utilised, though, is this is the actual transcript, not the edited transcript. And I think it is quite clear from the terms of the First Minister's exchange with Mr Neil is that he was referring to documents that had been published at the time of that interview. And that is, of course, Presiding Officer, always been the case that every document published by this Scottish Government or the previous Scottish executive, they were, of course, always underpinned by legal evidence. Can I also say I think it's very interesting to hear this criticism of the process of the First Minister referring himself to ministerial code. He's done it because he was asked to by a Labour MEP, and now they have the temerity to come here and criticise that. It's almost as if they were wishing he hadn't done so, because they could then complain that he hadn't done it. That's game playing, and again they need to raise their level of debate. And it's also interesting because the ministerial code, the process for referring a minister under the ministerial code, is now much stronger than it ever was under the previous administration. It used to be the case that a minister, when Jack McConnell was the First Minister, if he referred himself under the ministerial code, essentially he was investigating himself. We now have independence in the process, and I think that should be welcomed. Can I say, Presiding Officer, I said earlier it was unfortunate to see Labour having a debate on Scotland's future, but then debate anything. But I welcome the Deputy First Minister amendment because it allows us to focus on Scotland's future, and I want to focus certainly on one, if not two, of the issues that raised. Trident, I want to turn that because I want to say last week I was on television with Jackie Bailey, as was referred to. I was one of those backbenchers burning up my credibility, according to Joanne Lamont. And I was very interested to hear her say the difference between her and the First Minister as she tells the truth. Well, I want to say this carefully. Because I want to refer back to what the Presiding Officer said, so I will say this carefully. I would think that anyone who made that statement would want to be a lot more careful about making claims that the removal of Trident will cost thousands of jobs in Scotland, because it is not true. We saw an article in the Sunday Herald. No, Ms Bailey, you can sit down. We saw an article in the Sunday Herald this week which reveals, through Freedom of Information request, there are 520 civilian jobs at HM Naval Base Clyde that directly rely upon the Trident programme. And in response, we saw Stephen Boyd, Assistant Secretary of the Scottish Trade Union Congress, suggestions that as many 11,000 jobs would be lost to Scotland if Trident were not replaced are inaccurate. And of course that reflects their previous report that was published. And incidentally, one of the authors was Claudia Beamish. I think we'd do well to place that on record. That pointed out overall, it's far from the case that it would be the case that it would cost jobs. Overall, therefore, Scotland would economically be a net loser from any decision to replace Trident. There would be serious consequences for its public service and for employment over a prolonged period of time. I think we should place that on the public record. And we know that the SNP position is clear, Presiding Officer, because we agree with the Scottish Trades Union Congress. But what do we see from the Labour Party? We could refer back to the leadership contest that took place recently, because the Scottish CND asked all the leadership candidates what their position was in terms of the renewal of Trident. Tom Harris said,
can you start to wind up?
Indeed, I will, President Officer. I believe the UK should retain an independent nuclear deterrent while other countries possess nuclear weapons. Ken McIntosh, MSP. I support the Government's announcement to proceed to the initial stages of Trident's renewal. Joanne Lamont, MSP. Joanne Lamont did not respond to the survey, which was sent by post, by email twice. A message was also left in an answering machine in her office. If we're going to talk about Scotland's future, let's talk about Trident and let's find out what Joanne Lamont thinks.
I now call Hugh Henry to be followed by Annabel Ewing.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To some extent, as someone who opposes what the SNP are trying to do to Scotland, I maybe should have welcomed the events of the last week in terms of undermining the SNP's case, in terms of, I think, maybe fatally wounding their proposition. But there's a lot of what's happened in the last week that leaves me profoundly sad, because what it does demonstrate is that the First Minister actually holds this Parliament in contempt. He really doesn't care about its workings. He doesn't care about the way that it operates. And he actually feels that he can say anything, that even though it doesn't resemble the fact, he can say anything and no one will be able to do anything about it. It is contempt. No, in a couple of minutes. It is contempt of the highest order. And what we see here is a number of people who have had principled views about independence for many years, who passionately believe in it, prepared to put aside all their other principles, their integrity, in order to bolster the First Minister's fading credibility on something where he has clearly been found out. The First Minister, in this respect, delivers all the sincerity and all the talent of a snake oil salesman at Glasgow's Barras at the weekend. Willie Rennie and Ruth Davidson made two, I think, very interesting points. Willie Rennie, I think, put to bed this issue that people in his party or my party actually believe that somehow Scotland would be refused membership of the European Union. We have never ever said that that would be the case if Scotland decides to separate from the rest of the United Kingdom. The issue is the terms in which Scotland would become a member and what the consequences of that would be. And Ruth Davidson was right to highlight the inadequacies of the rigged inquiry by a hand-picked man appointed by the First Minister to investigate the First Minister. There is no substance in such an inquiry, which is why Joanne Lamont is right to call for an independent judicial inquiry. But the other thing that is conveniently overlooked in all of this debate about the ministerial code is 1.1 in that code that says Scottish ministers are expected to behave in a way that upholds the highest standards of propriety. Can we honestly say that our First Minister and his Deputy First Minister over the past week have upheld the highest standards? We cannot, because, it is unbelievable the number of people who have spoken to me in the last week, including people who believe in independence, who are appalled about what the First Minister has done over the last number of months. People who believe in independence but are losing credibility in anything that the First Minister has to say. But, there's other issues that we need to bottom out in terms of the ministerial code and this issue about legal advice. And I would like some clarity about who actually does provide that legal advice and why they are now asking the law officers to provide that legal advice. Because what the ministerial code says is that the Scottish law officers have ministerial responsibility for the provision of legal advice on all matters relating to the law of Scotland. It then goes on to say that the primary source of legal advice for the Scottish Government is the Scottish Government Legal Directorate. So why are the law officers being asked to deliver advice on something that the Directorate should be delivering advice on? And I think that needs to be clarified. But there's some other things that we've heard a lot about. The First Minister tried to say in STV, it's quite clear in the ministerial code, it's both the fact of whether it exists and the content. I would need to clear it with the Lord Advocate if I wanted to say that I had not sought legal advice. Well, as has already been pointed out by Jackie Bailey, the fact that the legal advice has or has not been given to the Scottish Government by the law officers is the issue. But the content of any legal advice given to them by anyone else must not be revealed without the law officer's prior consent. So in other words, you can release the fact of whether or not advice has been given, and then advice has to be sought on whether the content should be released. And that's something that you need to come up front and be honest about. But, it also goes on to say that we're hearing that they cannot release advice. Not true. The release of the content of legal advice is likely to be appropriate only in highly compelling cases. Well, how much more compelling does it need to be whether Scotland stays within the United Kingdom or leaves to form an uncertain future? Nothing is more compelling about that. But this First Minister, and I'll finish here, Presiding Officer, this First Minister has form in terms of not being totally upfront. In September 2007, I asked him if his pledge in class sizes would be met within the lifetime of that Parliament. He said to me, yes. I know for a fact, and it was subsequently revealed, that the ministers had been told that not only would it not be achieved by 2011, it probably couldn't be done by 2015. The ministers knew that, the Cabinet Secretary for Education knew that, and I am told from well-placed sources that the First Minister's office had been informed. So we have a First Minister who has a track record in hiding the facts, in hiding the truth. It's shameful, and he is bringing this Parliament into disrepute.
Annabel Ewing, to be followed by Mark MacDonald.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I would, before I commence my speech, just wish to comment on that disgraceful speech. The member talked about integrity. Well, could I just remind Hugh Henry that he, as far as I can see in this Parliament since my election last May, is the only member that has sought to bring into a debate in an absolutely disgusting way the children of another member of this Parliament. So shame on you, and how dare you talk about integrity, Presiding Officer. And clearly what he has shown is that he has no respect for the office of First Minister, and he has no respect. He has no respect for democracy in this country, where last May the people of Scotland put their trust in the SNP to govern their country, and that with a majority government. No, thank you.
The member has to be heard.
I would not take any intervention at this point, thank you. I have wasted far too much time in the disgusting comments of Mr Henry, but I just wish to put them on the record, Presiding Officer, and I would hope that they could be reflected upon further, perhaps, over the course of the afternoon. I am pleased to have been called to speak in this debate. It could perhaps be termed the future of Scotland too, since it was only a few weeks ago, as I recall, that we were speaking, and I was indeed pleased to be called to speak in the future of Scotland 1, or perhaps, on reflection, given the negativity, we could have called it Bleak House, because, Presiding Officer, there would have been a welcome for the sequel debate today. Indeed, it could have been a sort of blockbuster hit if Labour had sought to focus on the key substantive policy issues facing Scotland, such as Trident renewal or UK welfare cuts, if the focus had been on defining Labour's vision for Scotland in the years to come, and if they had been keen to use their Opposition Day debate to discuss what hope they could offer the citizens of our country for a brighter future for them and their families. But, Presiding Officer, sadly, what we have seen today, and what we indeed saw in the debate a few weeks ago, is the limitless negativity of the Labour Party, the complete lack of vision that they all seem to share for their country, their apparent contentedness to strive for so little for their fellow citizens, their preference for Tory rule on welfare rather than Home Rule, and their preference to spend billions upon billions of pounds on nuclear weapons rather than on schools and hospitals for our citizens. Well, in contrast, Presiding Officer, I and my SNP colleagues will place no ceiling on the ambition of our people and of our country. And we will not say, as Labour and the anti-independence parties do, that you can go this far but no further, and that for some reason we should accept second best, and that we are not capable of taking our own decisions but should have somebody else make them for us. Presiding Officer, it is of course the people who care most about our country who are best placed to take decisions affecting our country, and that means the people who live and work here. The historic Edinburgh Agreement now paves the way for the independence referendum and, crucially, for an agreed framework within which the process can be secured. And that agreement, picking up on one element of today's debate this afternoon, in turn provides the basis for legal advice from the law officers to be sought, including on EU membership, and that to me seems axiomatic. What I do find curious in the debate this afternoon, Presiding Officer, however, is a lack of any real understanding of what the fundamental principles underlying the EU are, in terms at least of the interventions from the opposition parties, and how indeed the EU operates in practice. For it has always been the case, and it remains the case, that the EU is an inclusive organisation. It is open to membership to all countries having a land area on the European continent who share common democratic principles and respect for human rights. So the idea that somehow uniquely Scotland would not be welcome is frankly ludicrous, and, as the Cabinet Secretary says, lacks any credibility. The next point to bear in mind is that, of course, we have been, as the excellent contribution from my colleague Aileen McLeod made clear, we have been in the EU for some 40 years. We are citizens of the EU, and we do have certain rights.
It is also to be recalled that it's actually very difficult to get out of the EU, and we need to look only at the instance of Greenland some years ago in that respect. So, as a matter of law, it is clear that Scotland is in the EU, and it will stay in the EU, and it will be in exactly the same position as a matter of international law on successor states as the rest of the UK. And that is indeed the sum of the eminence benchmark opinion that we have before us to date. As a matter of politics, it is quite clear that Scotland would be a very attractive prospect. Indeed, for Scotland has 1/4 of EU wind resources, 1/4 of EU tidal resources, and 1/10 of EU renewable energy wave resources. Are the independence parties really saying that Scotland would not be welcome in the EU? Are they really saying that with 90% of oil and gas reserves in the EU that Scotland would be ejected from the EU?
Members in their last minute.
Are they really saying that with 90% of oil and gas we would be rejected from the EU when no territory has ever been ejected before? Are they really saying, importantly, that with our vast fishing resources, that Scotland remaining a member of the EU would not be hugely attractive, in particular to certain member states that have been so cited this afternoon? What a silly debate the anti-independence parties have been reduced to, Presiding Officer. And why do they seem so enthusiastic about other countries' membership of the EU, but yet wish to invent an entirely make-believe world of difficulty for their own country? In conclusion, Presiding Officer, I have vision for my country. I wish to see it play its part on the basis of equality with other countries in the international fora of the world. I wish to see our country prosper and to see real social justice, where we have control over our own welfare system and treat people with dignity. Roll on, Presiding Officer, the 2014 independence referendum. Thank you.
Thank you. Before I move on, I need to take this opportunity to remind members of the Presiding Officer's words at the beginning of this session, and also to advise the Chamber that I cannot make rulings on what is said by members from sedentary positions, but I would ask them to desist from making remarks from sedentary positions. I now call Mark MacDonald to be followed by Ken Macintosh. Point of order, Sandra White.
Is that what you're saying then, is you can make any remark you wish as long as you're standing up, as Mr Henry did, and no one decides him?
I'm not saying that at all. If members make remarks without microphones from sedentary positions, then I am in no position to hear what they said and I cannot make a ruling. I now call Mark MacDonald to be followed by Ken Macintosh.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer, and I will do my best to approach this with the same level of humility and respect that Mr Henry managed to approach it with, or perhaps a lot more. Mr Henry, in his remarks, talked about the notion that your future either lies as part of the UK or an uncertain future as an independent country. And I was interested by that phraseology because the implication therein is that if Scotland remains part of the UK, its future is by definition certain. Yet, obviously, when I intervened on the leader of the Conservative Party, who pleasingly decided to drop the Vaudeville Act that she rolled out at First Minister's question to such universal acclaim, said that she could not confirm or deny whether the UK would remain a member of the EU in 5 or 10 years' time. Indeed, on Radio 4 just yesterday evening, the analysis programme looked at the Labour Party's relationship with the European Union, and within that, one of the commentators in that debate said that he felt that there was a 50-50 chance of the UK withdrawing from the European Union within the lifetime of the next UK Parliament, and also that he felt the party most likely to withdraw the UK from the European Union was the Labour Party. But that demonstrates, I think, Presiding Officer, that even within the UK, the future within the European Union would be uncertain. What we can say with some certainty, however, based on the precedent that we have available, that of Greenland, that of Sweden, is that your starting point as an independent nation or as a part of the European Union is that you start on the basis of being inside the European Union, and it is for you then to negotiate, should you choose to do so, the terms of your withdrawal. We also see from the example of Sweden and the very noteworthy points raised by my colleague Aileen MacLeod that being a member of the European Union does not automatically mean that you must be a member of the euro, a point that she made very clearly. But of course, we've already heard from the Labour benches that apparently your area of professional expertise is to be clouded on the basis of your political persuasions. On that basis, we probably shouldn't pay any attention to the Advocate General, Lord Wallace, nor indeed should we pay any attention to the Cuts Commission proposals which will be brought forward by Professor Arthur Midwinter, former adviser to the Labour Party. But if that's the parameters in which we're going to set it, that a person's political persuasions undermines their ability to engage in a debate, then that's a very sorry state of affairs indeed. And the disappointing thing is that we found ourselves in this debate purely based around process. And my eye was caught by an article on the 24th of June in the Morning Star, where it states, Left Labour MSP Neil Findlay said the referendum debate so far had been tedious. The people who inhabit Planet Normal, I'm assuming he counts himself as a member, are bored, he said. The Labour movement needs to cut through the BS and the sideshows and focus on the type of Scotland we want to see. I couldn't agree with Neil Findlay more on that. I know he said he never agrees with the Scottish National Party, but I will extend the charitable suggestion that I agree with Neil Findlay on that there should be a debate about the kind of Scotland that we all want to see. And I'll take an intervention from Mr Malik.
Hansala Malik.
Thank you very much. I just want to make two very subtle points. One is membership to the EU is not guaranteed, and Turkey is an example. But that said, I don't believe for a minute. Please allow me to finish. Please allow me to finish. However, I don't imagine that Scotland would be denied membership to the EU. It's at what price we would have to pay.
Mark MacDonald.
Well, I would say to Mr Malik that I accept his point that he doesn't believe Scotland would be denied membership of the EU. Our position is very clear that, different to Turkey, we're already in the European Union, and therefore we are a member state of the EU as part of the UK. We are also we also have EU citizenship rights, which are afforded to our citizens, which are not currently the case in Turkey. So it's not an analogous situation. But the point is that this should be a debate about the vision for the future. It should be a question of asking, what is the Scotland that we want to see? How do we see Scotland in the future? And there will be differences of opinion. I know it's often a figure of fun used by the Better Together parties that somehow, because Patrick Harvey and I share a different vision for the future of Scotland, that the Yes campaign is riven with splits. Well, one would hope that the Labour Party and the Tory Party don't have the exact same apocalyptic vision for the future. Well, I have to say my doubts are often rising on that point. But the point about the vision for Scotland in the future is that people should be asking themselves, what is it that I want to see Scotland look like in the future? How do I want to see Scotland develop? And then the question they should ask themselves is, does that vision for Scotland become more or less likely as a result of Scotland becoming independent? I believe firmly that my vision for a socially just future for Scotland, a future for Scotland without nuclear weapons, I'm sorry, I'm in my last 40 seconds, a future for Scotland without nuclear weapons, a future for Scotland delivering the kind of human decency and dignity to our citizens that we would all expect, not just for ourselves or for our relatives, but for our fellow Scots, is more likely as a consequence of independence, more likely as a consequence of taking control of our resources, whether they be natural, whether they be financial, whether they be human. That is the point around the vision debate. And it would be good if, just for a change, the Labour Party could heed the words of Neil Findlay. I know I'm probably never going to repeat that phrase, but on this, to get away from the sideshows and the process-laden nonsense, and actually to start talking about what the vision is for the future of Scotland. If, as Mr Henry asserts, they have a positive vision of a certain future for Scotland within the UK, well, let's hear what it is, because all I see at the moment for people on welfare, for public sector workers who are looking at their pension issues, all I see for these people is a future riven with uncertainty as part of the United Kingdom. So let's have the debate, let's have the honest debate about the Scotland we all want to see.
Thank you. I now call Ken McIntosh to be followed by Christina McKelvey.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And last week I thought did give many of us the opportunity to catch a glimpse of what life in an independent Scotland under an SNP administration might be like. And no, I'm not talking about the furore that surrounded the rather pretentiously named Edinburgh Agreement. I'll come on to that shortly. I'm referring to the film shown on the BBC, You've Been Trumped. I don't know if members here also saw it or how you felt, but I was embarrassed and ashamed. Embarrassed that Scotland could be treated like some sort of banana republic by this bully of a man, and ashamed that not only did we do nothing to stand up for the local residents, but that we actually seemed to have connived with this billionaire against the powerless. The lowest point for me was to see our own police officers seemingly intent on carrying out the bidding of Mr Trump against those who actually lived on the Many estate. I mention this documentary because, as with the rest of the events that played out here in the Scottish Parliament last week, one man was central to making all this happen, and that man is not the bullying billionaire Mr Trump. It is our esteemed First Minister, Mr Salmond, the very person who should have been there to stand up for his own local constituents, the very person who should have been there to defend our interests against the unscrupulous attentions of the rich and powerful, the very person who should have been there defending our proven systems of democratic accountability and decision-making. Instead, he was cozying up to this bully. He is the one who picked up the phone to the chief planner. He is the one who bypassed the democratic and accountable procedures, and who, as I understand matters, to this day has not had the courage or the decency to go and talk directly to the constituents, the residents who are his own constituents. Now, it is not the fact that our esteemed First Minister enjoys the company of rich and powerful men that worries me, although I do not believe it to be a particularly attractive character trait, but it is the treatment of his own office, the disregard for the office of First Minister and for the interests of the people of Scotland he is supposed to be representing that I find most disturbing, and that's what disturbs me about the other events last week. Many of us are very familiar, in a minute, Mr MacDonald, many of us are familiar with our esteemed First Minister's habit of making things up as he goes along. He makes assertions, and then he believes his own assertions. There are many examples, some of which have been quoted earlier, but one that I vividly recall from the last Parliament was when he rebutted a question at FMQs about falling numbers of qualified teachers in our nurseries. Now, I mention this one because it was one of many that came out around the issue of the SNP's broken election manifesto promises. And he rebutted the government's own statistical evidence that the number of teachers was falling with the answer, they are substantially increasing. Now, an argument could have been made over how much the number of teachers was falling by, but under no scenario was it increasing, never mind substantially. At the very least, the First Minister misspoke. But true to form, instead of apologising to the Chamber or correcting himself, our esteemed First Minister sent out his human shield to set the record straight. In that case, it was the then junior Education Minister, Adam Ingram, someone I have a lot of respect for. And that pattern has been repeated last week, as he sent out the hapless Jamie Hepburn to be slaughtered by Andrew Neil, and the less hapless but equally unfortunate and uncomfortable Deputy First Minister, who was left squirming by Gordon Brewer on Newsnight. At least those individuals have some credibility. But then, as now, when his own trust is at stake, the First Minister hides behind the trust, the credibility and the respect that others have earned. Mr MacDonald?
Mark MacDonald.
I thank the member for giving way. As somebody who did go and visit residents in the Many estate, perhaps he would like to remind me and perhaps the Chamber of under whose watch, first of all, Mr Trump was invited to Scotland, and secondly, what role his party played in supporting the Trump development, both locally and nationally.
Ken McIntosh.
I think Mr MacDonald seems to miss the point, which is that the First Minister intervened directly, bypassing normal procedures, on behalf of a billionaire and picked up the phone himself to the chief planner and intervened directly. Now, that is not something that any other MSP, never mind any member of the public, could do. And that is what is an abuse of office. And that's why I dislike what has been, and very concerned about what's been happening last week. It's not about the behaviour of one individual. It's about the fact that he is abusing the office of First Minister and the power that goes with that. Now, this should be an honest place for honest debate. There are parliamentary colleagues here who have had the humility to come to Parliament, John Swinney and Nicola Sturgeon are amongst them, and who have retained their dignity and their respect by being more open and honest with this Chamber and the rest of Scotland. But our esteemed First Minister hides behind others. He hides behind assertion, and he won't admit when he has led all of us to believe something that is not actually true. And it matters for two reasons. Yes, it matters because it reflects on the office of First Minister and the credibility of this Scottish Parliament. But it also matters because these are crucial decisions which affect every Scot, which affect everyone living in Scotland. I would hope that despite recent adverse events in Europe, we would wish to be members of the European Union, and I would further hope that the European Union would wish to retain us as members. But, and this is the point that Willie Rennie and Hugh Henry and others have made, that is a far cry from agreeing the terms of that membership. We need to know whether we would have to renegotiate those terms. One way or another, we need to know whether those terms would include a share of the UK's rebate, would they include a veto, and centrally, would we need to join the euro? Clarity on this latter point is not just a matter of the utmost practical significance, it is a highly politically significant one too. Given what has happened in the Eurozone over the last year, the chances of Scotland voting for independence, if as a result we had to join the euro, are virtually nil. It would be the killer blow as far as the SNP's dreams of independence are concerned. And unfortunately, Presiding Officer, I believe that is why the people get the accurate impression that the SNP will say absolutely anything to make sure that does not happen. We are not having a frank debate about independence. This is not about the power of argument. This is all about the power of assertion.
Please draw to conclusion.
The SNP have asserted we would have the safety net of the Bank of England, the sterling zone and Monetary Policy Committee when none of these are proven facts. This is about having an open and honest debate. It is not about the character just of one politician. It is about his position, about his public office. He is the First Minister of Scotland, and he does that office a disservice when he fails to treat the Scottish Parliament and the Scottish people with the respect we deserve.
Thank you. Christina McKelvey, to be followed by Stuart McMillan.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Like many of my colleagues, I was delighted to see the title of this motion, and at last I thought, Labour's got it. They've got the point. They've realised the future of Scotland does matter. I have been thinking for the past few days about the many things that Labour could bring up in this debate. Our economic future? Absolutely. Our humanitarian future? Possibly. Our welfare future? Most definitely. Instead, what do we get? We get the no future for Scotland under Labour debate. We get snipe, we get snarl, we get lashing out because they cannot make an argument for their discredited and failing union. So let's look at the only arguments for the union, coined very recently by a friend of mine. Your main parliament will be hundreds of miles away and your MPs will be in a small minority. You will have a government you didn't vote for. You will hand over all your oil and gas revenues to the London Treasury. The biggest nuclear arsenal in Western Europe will be based on the River Clyde, 30 miles from your largest city. An austerity budget will be imposed from London, cutting jobs and threatening public services instead of Scotland being responsible for raising and spending its own taxes. You will join a country whose health and education services are rapidly being privatised. Well, that's a manifesto to be proud of, isn't it? No, I think not. Labour, in their lashing out over the last few weeks, talk about dishonesty. Well, let's have an honest debate about Scotland's place in Europe. I'll see you, a Spanish foreign minister, and raise you, Mr Almunia, the European Commissioner for Competition and Vice President of the European Commission, who is absolutely a fierce opponent of Catalan independence, who said this week, he said, it would not be honest to say a breakaway region would be stuck outside the EU if it was independent. He said it would not be honest. Mr Almunia also insisted citizens of the EU could not be stripped of their rights just because their territory separated from member states. There we have it, nailed. It would not be honest. It says it all. So again, let's look at honesty. Is it honest to cry foul just because something does not suit their negative agenda but suited them very well in government? Was it honest to suppress a top-secret document, the Macron report, to deny the people of Scotland the full facts on the benefits of Scotland's oil? Let me just quote the main conclusion of the Macron report, just in case you've forgotten it, because it was so secret for 30 years. This paper has shown, and I quote, the advent of North Sea oil has completely overturned the traditional economic arguments against Scottish nationalism. An independent Scotland could now expect to have massive surpluses, both on its budget and on its balance of payments. And with the proper husbanding of the resources, this situation could last for a very long time in the future. Unquote. Was that the honest actions of 30 years of Labour and Tory governments hell-bent on stripping every penny out of Scotland? Is it honest to convene a Cuts Commission which will punish the sick, the old and the young? Is it honest to call the people of Scotland something-for-nothing culture? I think Joanne Lamont got that phrase mixed up when she actually meant that Labour are the nothing-for-something party. Because when the people of Scotland face the most savage welfare cuts, they get nothing from Labour. When the people of Scotland face the continuation of being a nuclear dump for Westminster, what do they get from Labour? Yes, nothing. Utter silence. When the people of Scotland face attacks on the universal benefits from Labour's Cuts Commission, what do they get? Nothing. When their pals, the Tories, devastated public sector pensions yesterday at Westminster, again, we got nothing from Westminster Labour, who sat in their hands and allowed their Tory pals to lay waste to the pension provisions of Scotland. Yes, Labour, the nothing-for-something party. That's something, Presiding Officer, is the dignity and the independence of our elderly by taking away their free personal care and their bus pass. That something is the denial to free education to our young folk by creating a situation where you can learn as long as you're rich. That something is the return to the Sick Man of Europe tag because they will end free prescription. That something is the pillage of our oil and gas resources to shore up illegal wars and pay for weapons of mass destruction. No questions asked yesterday, no questions asked today about £350 million squandered when people are at food banks and losing their jobs. No questions at all. That something is the subjugation of our nation to a Tory-Labour alliance at Westminster, not interested in the people of Scotland. Yes, the nothing-for-something party, the future of Scotland under Labour. How dare they come to this chamber to talk about the future of Scotland and present no vision, no hope and no ideas of what that future would be. Scotland deserves better.
Thank you. And I call Stuart McMillan to be followed by Lewis MacDonald.
Presiding Officer, as you can imagine, won't be voting for the Labour
motion.
Order,
please.
I won't be voting for the Labour motion this afternoon. I'll be supporting the amendment in the name of Nicola Sturgeon. Yet again, we have a Labour motion of rhetoric and hyperbole, when in fact the questions that the public want answered are the details of independence or remaining within the Union. The Labour's motion talks about confusion as to whether or not legal advice has been sought, and I did omit some words, only 13, not 27. However, surely when the Labour Party embarked on this crusade after the previous 5 have failed, they would have actually done some research beforehand. Now, during the first parliamentary session, when Ian Gray and Jack McConnell were ministers, they both, in written responses to parliamentary questions, provided clarity on the issue. Ian Gray said, in a response, whether legal advice is sought by or provided to ministers on any subject is a confidential matter. That was sent out on the 8th of November 2002. And Jack McConnell said, it is not the practice of the Scottish Executive to disclose whether they have taken legal advice on an issue, nor to disclose the nature of any legal advice received. That was the 3rd of July in the year 2000. Now, I may be wrong, Presiding Officer, but it appears to me that on the issue of legal advice, the Labour Party are doing two things. First of all, they are playing politics with the issue, knowing full well that legal advice is neither confirmed nor denied or disclosed unless permission to do so is granted by the law officers. Or secondly, and I believe this actually to be the main reason why they're doing this, it is to provide a smokescreen for their own inadequacies in providing a positive vision for Scotland. Their Cuts Commission is not something that they can actually crow about, cutting free personal care, cutting the bus pass, cutting eye tests, ending the council tax freeze, to name just a few. Now, I'm sure that certainly none of us in the chamber, I know certainly on this side of the chamber, would actually agree with Labour's Cuts agenda. It's also not something that any of us could actually go and sell as a positive vision for Scotland on the doorsteps. Now, the smokescreen doesn't just hide Labour's inadequacies. It's also an attempt, I believe, to hide their hand-in-glove coalition with the Tories in Scotland in the No campaign. Now, their coalition, or the partnership with the Tories, sticks in the craw of hundreds of thousands of people in Scotland. People haven't forgotten how Mrs Thatcher's policies affected our communities, with the Tories and the Lib Dems having embarked on a welfare cuts agenda which will once again hammer many communities and people in Scotland. I would urge the Labour Party to think again about getting into bed with Cameron and Clegg. If the Prime Minister and the Tories are the masters in this coalition, it then begs the question of who actually are the puppets. Now, before I go on to discuss the matters of real importance to the people of Scotland and why Scotland's future should be as a normal independent nation. I thought it's quite revealing to read of Labour's agenda. It was reported in a Sunday newspaper that a Labour strategist admitted that to get a no vote in the referendum, the tactic is to launch personal attacks upon the First Minister. I believe, presiding officer, that the people of Scotland deserve better than this. The people of Scotland want politicians to actually try and work together to improve the country, not spend their time cooking up new ways of attacking the First Minister. The people of Scotland want to know what Scotland will be like if they vote either yes or no. And the nonsense that is lobbed with regularity from the Labour Party does them and also the people of Scotland a disservice. Presiding officer, I believe that an independent Scotland in the EU is the best option for the country. Now, last week, after giving evidence to the Westminster Parliament's House of Lords Select Committee, Liz Cameron, the Chief Executive of Scottish Chambers of Commerce, stated, "I am delighted that my fellow panellists agreed with Scottish Chambers of Commerce that continued membership of the EU is of huge advantage to Scottish business. Whatever the outcome of the referendum, ensuring that this can continue is a priority." This is actually one of the important issues, and also one that the No campaign needs to address. Labour have been silent on the EU membership. The Lib Dems are positively gushing about the EU, and the Tories are trying to deal with a Eurosceptic wing to stave off the challenge of UKIP at the next European elections. Now, the Prime Minister's comments of vote for me in 2015, and I might just give you a referendum on EU membership, sounds very familiar to us here in Scotland, i.e. earlier in January, vote no and I'll give you more powers, but without mentioning what the powers are actually going to be. The No campaign are all over the place on this particular issue. Scotland's business community do want answers on EU membership, so that they can plan accordingly. During the 14 minutes of Johan Lammett's speech earlier today, and in the previous debates on Scotland's future, there is still a vacuum of vision for Scotland and a vacuum of policy for Scotland's place in the world. In conclusion, presiding officer, I've got a bit more time. OK, I'll take it.
Mr Kelly.
Speaking of vacuums, Mr McMillan, perhaps you can explain why the First Minister's not been able to appear today, why he's running scared and he's not been able to come to Parliament to account for his actions in the last week.
Stuart McMillan.
I'm afraid if James Kelly doesn't understand the importance of renewable energy and the jobs potential to Scotland in it, I'm afraid there's a vacuum in him and not certainly in this chamber. Presiding officer, in conclusion, I do believe that a Scotland free from Trident, a Scotland free from tuition fees, and a Scotland that actually has the full ability to deal with the social issues affecting our population is actually far more important than the lack of vision actually portrayed by the Labour Party. Listen to Labour, they want Trident, they want tuition fees, and they're content to sign up to the pact with their Tory and Lib Dem colleagues on welfare reform. How else, presiding officer, can anyone else suggest or otherwise think that Labour prevail, that certainly Scotland can't actually do things for themselves? Labour really have to decide and tell the people of Scotland why they prefer a Tory government as compared to self-government for Scotland. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I now call on Lewis MacDonald to be followed by Bob Doris.
Thank you very much.
6 minutes, please.
There are no limits to what this government will do to avoid addressing the issues of substance around the independence referendum, because it is ministers and only ministers who have turned the serious and substantial issue of legal advice on Scotland and Europe into their own political pantomime. Yes, we have, said Alex Salmond. Oh no, we haven't, said Nicola Sturgeon. So now they've decided to have an inquiry into the ministerial code to try to show that they could both be right after all. Well, on Thursday, the First Minister told us that he had invited Sir David Bell to join the independent panel of advisers and to lead the investigation into his own conduct. Then at the weekend, it transpired that Sir David Bell would not merely lead the investigation. He, in fact, would be the investigation. The very same Permanent Secretary who had advised Mr Salmond to bring in Sir David Bell had on the very same day called up Lord Fraser of Cornwall and told him that he was to be stood down from this investigation. Perhaps that was because Lord Fraser recognises that the issue here goes far beyond the confines of the ministerial code. Alex Salmond's decision to stand down both Lord Fraser and Dame Eilish Angelini is not part of the solution. It is a symptom of the problem. And the problem is a First Minister who delights in manipulating the machinery of government to his own ends. His defence is that this is an investigation of the law officer's prerogatives. It is not. Alf Young reminded Scotsman readers on Saturday the primary source of legal advice to ministers is not, in fact, the law officers, it's the government's own lawyers in the Scottish Government Legal Directorate. Ministers are bound by paragraph 230 of the Ministerial Code to ensure that the legal implications of pursuing Scottish independence in Europe are considered with their legal directorate at the earliest opportunity. If they did not do that, that in itself may have been a breach of the Ministerial Code. And the Code also says that law officers, and I quote, must be consulted in good time before the government is committed to significant decisions involving legal considerations, on the basis of a reference from the Scottish Government Legal Directorate at the request of the government lawyers, of ministers or of the law officers themselves. And again, on the basis of what Nicola Sturgeon has said, it would appear that the government's lawyers did not refer the issue of Scotland and Europe to the law officers, whether at the request of ministers or otherwise. Given the requirements of paragraph 231 of the Ministerial Code, that looks very much like another breach of it. And the much-loved paragraph 235 is also worth a closer look. Whether legal advice has or has not been given to ministers by the government's own legal directorate, who are the primary source of such legal advice, is not covered by that clause. Ministers are fully at liberty to tell us whether such advice has been asked for or given. The Lord Advocate has said today that he consented to Nicola Sturgeon revealing that she had asked for legal advice last week because of the exceptional circumstances of the case. This is a matter of fundamental importance to the country and to the referendum debate, he says in his letter to Ruth Davidson, now available in Spice. A significant amount of legal comment and analysis on the issue is already in the public domain, and this is an issue of international importance which may set a precedent. All very true, but all true for very many months, and regardless of the terms of the referendum agreement that a statement was made on in Parliament last week. So the Lord Advocate recognises clearly the exceptional circumstances and responsibility for the failure to ask for his consent to reveal the fact of legal advice or not rests squarely with ministers. And they have questions to answer about the Ministerial Code. They failed to ensure that the legal implications of pursuing independence in Europe were considered with the Scottish Government Legal Directorate at the earliest opportunity. They failed to ask government lawyers to refer the matter to law officers in good time before committing to significant decisions such as to hold a referendum on independence. And then ministers went to court to cover up those failures. And that court action was not just a waste of public money. It was also a cover-up for failures in the most basic responsibilities of government, that ministers should take decisions regarding the future of their country, and I quote, in a fully informed legal context, as the Ministerial Code demands. But as Lord Fraser affirms, this is about more than breaches of the Ministerial Code. That is why an inquiry appointed by Alex Salmond, with a remit written by Alex Salmond, to consider the actions of Alex Salmond in relation to the Ministerial Code just will not do. The deliberate exclusion of the two former Lord Advocates who might know how it's supposed to work shows that this inquiry has been designed with only one possible outcome in mind. What we need is an independent inquiry into the words and actions of ministers and full disclosure of all the legal advice offered and received on Scotland and Europe. Only if those things happen can we then hope to move on to the issues of substance that should surely concern us all.
Thank you very much. I now call on Bob Doris to be followed by Paul Martin.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I just reflect briefly on Lewis MacDonald's speech? I don't agree with the content, and that won't surprise Lewis MacDonald, but can I congratulate him on conducting himself in terms of the language and the tone that he used within the speech, singling him out from the rest of the other contributions from the Labour benches and from other speakers. I think he did himself some credit there. We've heard expressions used in this debate such as not telling the truth, dishonest. Last week it was straight as a corkscrew. We've already heard this week snake oil salesman used within the chamber. Quite frankly, if you're prepared to say something in a TV studio, you're prepared to say it in this chamber, or you should just hod your wheest, quite frankly. So why not use the expression bear red-faced liar, I would ask. And it seems to be bullish bravado in the studios and bottle merchants within this chamber. Now, I am actually delighted that the expression wasn't used in this chamber, because it is unparliamentary language and it just debases the entire political debate. But you shouldn't be doing a tour of the TV and radio stations to debase that political debate out with this chamber either. So I think it's clear that the Labour and the better together tactic is to have a personalised attack and a negative campaign. And I have to say, whenever Labour have a personalised attack and a negative campaign, it tends to be the Scottish Government that comes up trumps. So I have no objection to that. Now, I want to actually congratulate Labour on one aspect as well, talking about the European Union, because I think it's important that we do shine a light on the European Union. And Aileen McLeod's already mentioned the 120 or so Tory MPs who are openly campaigning to pull back from Europe. Now, also, it's not just the Conservative Party. If I could quote the Labour MP, John Cryer, and I'm quoting from the Daily Mail, quite helpful when looking at right-wing reactionary comments. I apologise to Daily Express that I didn't use their particular quotes, but Labour MP John Cryer, a leading member of the party's Eurosceptic wing, who is in favour of holding a referendum on leaving the EU, said, "There has always been a strong streak of Euroscepticism running through the Labour Party, which has been obscured by all the attention paid to the Conservatives." And it's reported, not a lone voice, reported that up to 50 Labour MPs would associate themselves with those comments, and no non-entities, the likes of former ministers such as Frank Field and Kate Hoey, amongst these Eurosceptics. So I think when Willie Rennie mentioned a step into the dark during the conversations in the European Union, what I would say to Willie Rennie and others in the Better Together campaign is it's time to shine a light on what the Better Together parties really believe in terms of the European Union, because I don't think that has been apologies, but I want to make some progress. I don't think that has been exposed, and I think when that is exposed, the people of Scotland will certainly, I think, to be fair, we heard quite enough during your opening speech, Joanne Lamont. And I want to go and talk about the Edinburgh Agreement. Now, it would seem eminently reasonable to me that once you have an agreed process set in place, that then you would want to look at taking any specific legal advice. Now, I freely accept that the Scottish Government and the SNP have said we believe that a referendum would be legally binding in any respect, but, you know, seeking agreement and consensus, as the Labour Party asked us to do, was the way forward. And now that we have that agreement and consensus, I would argue that is the perfect time to take that legal advice. Yes, very briefly.
Rhoda Grant.
Would Bob Doris not agree that we should seek legal advice, but not only that, we should make that public, and that we shouldn't hide the fact that legal advice has been sought or indeed not sought? How much would he spend in hiding something that doesn't exist?
A number of questions there, but what I can say is I would agree with Patricia Ferguson, Sarah Boyack, Jim Wallace and Henry McLeish, who all failed to say whether they had or revealed legal advice. So consistency is important, not just in government, but also in opposition. I'd like to move on now to some of the issues in relation to Scotland's future and not the processes Labour seem to be concerned with. Now, Scotland's future, I want to be a nuclear-free future. So does the Scottish Government, so does the SNP, so do the Yes Scotland campaign, but not the Better Together parties who are nuclear parties. Now, we heard earlier on Claudia Beamish was part of an STUC report in 2007 looking at the benefits of a nuclear-free Scotland. I'd like to quote a little bit more from that as well. It was estimated that up to 3,000 public sector jobs could be at risk if the current £153 million annual operating costs, approximately £50 million, comes back to Scotland in terms of wages and those maintaining Trident or Scottish service personnel staffing Trident. In other words, keeping Trident costs up to 3,000 public sector jobs, not according to me, but according to Claudia Beamish and according to the STUC. So not my words, but the words of the STUC. Very quickly, Presiding Officer, I wish the Labour Party in Scotland's future would like to... Do you have time, Presiding Officer?
Yes, if you want.
Yes.
Claudia Beamish.
I thank the member for allowing the intervention.
Could he clarify whether that part of the report was written by myself? And also, this was an attempt to have an honest debate, a clear debate about what the future was and what the alternatives were in relation to defence in a very wide-ranging group of people, including the STUC and some eminent academics, to look at the future and have that discussion some time ago.
Mr Doris, briefly, please.
Thank you. I should point out to Claudia Beamish, I didn't pull out some obscure part from that particular report. I quoted from the executive summary, which Claudia Beamish would have signed up to. Of course, very briefly, because of the intervention, I'd like to point out that we heard nothing in terms of welfare reform. I'm not surprised, Presiding Officer, given the fact that Labour MPs did not vote in the Public Service Pensions Reform Bill last night, and I thought that may have been because they were whipped to abstain or not to vote, but I understand they had a free vote in that. They were not whipped. They just chose not to turn up and defend the interests of Scottish public sector workers. I think that's a scandal. It's a scandal that will end with independence, who will truly look after Scotland's future.
Many thanks. Many thanks. I now call on Paul Martin to be followed by Rob Gibson. 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I say, first of all, Presiding Officer, I consider myself a fair-minded person. Perhaps the kind of fair-minded person that Nicola Sturgeon referred to last week. And can I confirm my absolute clarity on this by congratulating the Minister on securing the Edinburgh Agreement last week? And yes, of course, we do want to have a discussion and a debate on Scotland's future. But, Presiding Officer, I've raised the very question, how can we possibly have a debate in Scotland's future if this government withhold information from the Scottish Parliament, and if the First Minister fails to appear before the Scottish Parliament and give us the very opportunity for those questions to be raised and that very opportunity to move forward. But, Presiding Officer, what is becoming very clear is that the government either don't have the answers or they make it up as they go along. And yes, that is the case. And of course, again, we have heard the First Minister being fast and loose with his answers on the future of Scotland. And that is, of course, unacceptable. But one thing we should keep in mind, Presiding Officer, is in the comfort zone of this debating chamber, it is easy for us to have this very debate. But for those families whose futures and livelihoods depend on the very decisions that we will take in this debating chamber, it is unacceptable that many of these questions have not been answered to date, and many of them do not appear to have been answered for the future. Now, the Deputy Presiding Officer, as far as I'm concerned, the Deputy First Minister was right when she said that any fair-minded person would interpret what the First Minister said in his interview with Andrew Neil last week. Now, here is how I see it. Right-minded people across Scotland can see what the First Minister has been caught out. He wanted to create the impression that he'd done his homework and the EU membership had all the necessary legal tests. Instead of being honest, he blustered his way to the end of this interview and used £12,000 worth of public money to cover his tracks in court. Presiding Officer, the First Minister should pay back every penny of the public money that he's wasted in this court action to defend the legal advice that never was. I'll give way to Jamie Hepburn.
Jamie Hepburn.
And of course, Presiding Officer, what Paul Martin calls bluster today, he said was a barefaced lie last week, but not in this chamber. He described himself as a fair-minded person. Is he still standing by that accusation, or is he brave enough to repeat it in this chamber?
Paul Martin.
Presiding Officer, can I say, first of all, I stand by any comments I've made outside this chamber. But can I also say, for members like Jamie Hepburn, they have become experts in providing a defence for the First Minister. Well, they should get used to it, because we will probe the First Minister at every possible opportunity. And maybe they will have to come back in to this chamber and defend their First Minister. That's an issue between them and the First Minister. Now, Presiding Officer, of course, the shambolic attempts by the First Minister to cover his tracks last week. The First Minister agreed to refer himself for investigation on whether or not he broke the ministerial code. To use Nicola Sturgeon's term, it is unfortunate that the ministerial code does not cover interviews with BBC journalists. And Alex Salmond is picked on who will decide and who will be the judge and jury of this process. That's far, far from the objective process that this process should be, Presiding Officer. There should be an objective process in prosecuting the very future of the challenges that faces, and the First Minister has a role in that. And I believe that the argument that the Lord Fraser should be excluded from the case because he's a former law officer is absolutely ridiculous. It would be like saying that Alex Salmond should exclude former presiding officers from making judgment because as former presiding officers they cannot be trusted to make impartial judgments on the conduct of ministers in Parliament. We know exactly the reason why Lord Fraser has been excluded from this process and the contempt that the First Minister has shown for this Parliament and his own appointments. And he's well aware that this Parliament is perceived as a fix, and it would be as pointless as Pinocchio doing a lie detector test. The Presiding Officer, as I said, there should be a full and open judicial inquiry. All aspects of this fiasco should be interrogated at every possible opportunity. And all of the documents that were made available to the ministers, including the legal advice that Jackie Bailey sought earlier today, should be provided to the judicial inquiry. And it should not be for the First Minister to drip-feed information to this Parliament. It should be for an objective process that ensures that every aspect of the process that was followed is properly interrogated. Presiding Officer, this is the most important decision that will face the future of Scotland in living memory. It is not for this government to play fast and loose with the future of our communities and our local constituencies. It is for us to move forward in a positive manner, and we will do that. I support the amendment in the name of Joanne Lamont.
Many thanks. Now Colin Rob Gibson. Jamie Hepburn, point of order.
Presiding Officer, I wonder if you could advise us where any member says in this chamber that they are standing by a statement that they've made out with the chamber where they have accused another member of being a barefaced liar, whether that constitutes unparliamentary language or not.
Do not believe so. The language used outside the chamber is a matter for the member, and his response thereafter is a matter for him as well. Now, Colin Rob Gibson, 6 minutes, please, Mr. Gibson, after which we'll move to closing speeches.
Well, thank you, Presiding Officer. I've had to sit and listen to a debate where we're told that the people of Scotland want clarity. I think that what's been proposed today is not seeking clarity about the way forward for our nation, and I believe that, in fact, there are quite clear signals from the process which was achieved last week in the Edinburgh Agreement and the setting up of the Referendum Bill Committee, of which I'm proud to be a member. Our timetable is clear. Before the end of November, we'll be dealing with the legal issue of Section 30. Thereafter, we'll be dealing with the issue of the ways in which 16 and 17-year-olds will be able to vote. And sometime next year, we'll be looking at the referendum bill itself, for which advice will be given on the questions which people want to know answers for before they come to that great decision which the referendum will bring in 2014. During that debate, the legal advice will be clear. At that time, when people want to make up their minds, they will have that in the government documents, and indeed this Parliament will be able to discuss that advice and know that we're talking about the situation as close to the referendum as we can be with certainty on these matters. Meanwhile, we have to sit and listen to a Labour Party hiding behind a smokescreen because they don't want to discuss these issues. All the huffing and puffing over process is about obscuring their behaviour in this Parliament, in London, and the way in which they treat the Scottish people with contempt. Just last night, when Labour failed to vote to save public pensions, it showed the line that they are moving down. Many colleagues have mentioned this already, but in fact it's an appalling lack of support for the public sector workers who are the backbone of this country. Now, I want to go on and say about lots of the other things they don't say. No, thank you. I'll come to the European Union in a minute, but there's been a lot of debate about the way in which the Trident issue is being discussed, and indeed the fact that the Labour leader refused to say in this Parliament or outside it what her position was on Trident. Well, you know, she's been able to ape what's been said in a Eurosceptic way about Europe from her leaders in London. Why couldn't she just take their line on Trident? Why does she have to follow the welfare agenda by supporting a Tory Liberal government down there which is ripping the heart out of the lives of families that need the support of the people in this Parliament and which they have abrogated? No, thank you. They're Eurosceptics chasing the South East of England vote, sending up dog whistle signals about cutting the EU's budget. It's all aimed at power in London and nothing to do with Scotland's future whatsoever. They don't say anything about that, and I think we have to look at why. Turning to the European Union issue itself, there are supporters in the Liberal benches here who differ slightly from their London masters, peddle a whole lot of nonsense as well. Willie Rennie this afternoon claimed that we would have to adopt the euro. Well, why does Sweden not have the euro since it's been a member since 1995? That's already been explained. And Bulgaria, and the Czech Republic, and Hungary, and Latvia, and Lithuania, and Poland, and Romania, and indeed, next year, no thank you, indeed, next June, Croatia will join the European Union, and it will not be in the euro. It couldn't be till at least 2017, and in fact, whether it wanted to or not, that's the position of a new member state. So, Willie Rennie, you're wrong. The claims that we would have to adopt the euro are false. So, no thank you. In terms of the way in which this changing EU is perceived, it's going to be looser, not deeper. It's going to have new members by 2016. There's going to be many new nations in the world in that time. And there are many other nations vying to be members of the European Union at this time, which will change the way in which the European Union itself adapts to the new world in which it tries to bring people together. Labour are not saying that they want to keep Scotland in the European Union. They're adopting the attitude of London. They're trying to keep us hermetically sealed in a little package here that is not recognising that when we went into a union with England in 1707, we did so as equal partners. This partner is reviewing that process at the moment in the referendum bill committee that I'm a member of. And therefore, what will Labour's manifesto say? When we gain independence, and we have the first elections, what will the Labour Party's manifesto say in the first elections in an independent parliament? Blank faces across there. The Edinburgh Agreement gives us certainty to go forward. And every nation has its unique route to the future. Scotland's is moving forward steadily and will not be diverted into discussions of process which will take their due place when we have the referendum bill published.
Thank you very much. We'll now move to the closing speeches, and I call on Willie Rennie. 6 minutes, a generous 6 minutes, Mr. Rennie.
I was intrigued by Robert Gibson's new plan for Europe. I'm not quite sure if he's planning to be a EU commissioner designing this great new Europe under the SNP with his great influence. But it was more fantasy than fact, and I'll return to the point about the euro later on. The SNP spent a lot of time criticising the Labour Party in this debate, saying that the Labour Party weren't positive. But I don't think I heard one single positive word from the SNP in their criticism of the Labour Party. So if you're going to try to be positive, can I give you one bit of advice? Try to be positive when you're doing it. Tends to work. Bob Doris's was actually a wee bit more moderate, and it's the kind of the new Bob Doris. But then proceeded to list all the derogatory language that he was criticising other people for using. Another bit of advice, Bob, if you don't want to use derogatory language, don't use derogatory language. Yes, certainly.
Mary Scanlon.
Can I make a positive contribution to this debate, as I couldn't get in to the SNP? Can I state from the European Commission update 8th of August 2012, Sweden has not yet adopted the euro, but in accordance with the treaty, it will do so once it meets the necessary conditions, which are bank reform and economic convergence criteria. So they are not in the euro because they've not met the conditions, but under the treaty they will be in the euro and must be in the euro. That's from the European Commission.
Thank you. Mr Rennie.
I'm glad Mary Scanlon got her opportunity for a full speech. A contribution to it. I think Mary Scanlon is right, though, because the one thing that Aileen MacLeod omitted to say was that Sweden has a derogation. And what she could not guarantee that Scotland would have a derogation. And that's the point about all this. They cannot guarantee anything. It's all guesswork. They can point to their favourite lawyers. They can point to their favourite European commissioners or MEPs that say something. But they fail to give any credit, not just now, they fail to give any credit to people who have a contrary point of view. But there is doubt. That's the whole point of this. There is doubt. And because creating an independent nation means that there is no return, it's not like some normal bill. There is no way back, so we need a greater level of proof. We need a higher degree of certainty, which is why we need the Scottish Government to show us the legal basis of their legal advice. But also, they need to show that 27 members of the European Union agree with that. If they don't get that, it's a step into the dark. We will not know the future, not just now. The point about the Edinburgh Agreement was interesting, because I was under the clear impression the Edinburgh Agreement was really an agreement about the referendum. Now, except that the UK Government has accepted within that process that they will accept the result. That does not oblige the United Kingdom to agree to every single demand of an independent Scotland, and it would be silly for them to be required to do so. But that's what the SNP seem to think that that's what it means. It doesn't. It's simply about a process to get to the referendum. Now, the United Kingdom government will be reasonable. I'm sure if Scotland goes independent, it's a reasonable country. But what it won't do is just to agree to every single demand that an independent Scotland thinks it's entitled to, especially if it's against the interests of 27 members of the European Union and of the United Kingdom. The Edinburgh Agreement is about the process for the referendum, the Section 30 order. It's for nothing more than that. And the SNP need to understand what they've signed up to. The point about this is really about more than simply legal advice. This is about politics. And if I can quote the Spanish Foreign Minister, who I'm sure the SNP don't like to hear from, in the hypothetical case of independence, Scotland would have to join the queue and ask to be admitted. Now, that's what he says. They can't ignore. Yes, certainly. Go on.
Jamie Hepburn.
I quote another Spaniard back to Willie Rennie, the Vice President of the European Commission, Vice President Almunia, who says there's no mechanism by which you can remove the citizens that people in Scotland have acquired as European citizens. There's absolutely no mechanism to do it.
Willie Rennie.
Jamie Hepburn makes my point. He makes my point is that there are contrary views. There is no absolute certainty about it. John Mason hit the nail on the head. There is no absolute certainty about this. And because it's about creating an independent country, we need more certainty, especially because the First Minister and the Deputy First Minister have been making contradictory statements about whether they had the legal advice in the first place. Helen Eadie.
A very good reason for the Scottish Parliament's committee, for the European External Affairs Committee, to have a public inquiry on this issue. But secondly, is he also aware that one of the other persons who cast doubt on this was the much respected individual of the SNP who was a member of who was an MEP, and that is Neil Mackintosh, Professor Mackintosh, who was also quite categorical. There was a lot of questions about this and absolute no certainty about Scotland's membership in the EU.
Thank you. Willie Rennie.
I think Helen Eady is right. There needs to be an inquiry. And if the SNP members in this chamber refuse to have that inquiry in committee, I think they're letting Scotland down. So Helen Eady is right. But also Neil McIntosh her reference to Neil McIntosh was right too, because there is doubt. And even the SNP admit that there would have to be a negotiation. And by that very admission, they are implying that there would have to be a bit of give and take. And if there's give and take, you lose something. And that's what the potential is for an independent Scotland. At the end of this debate, what we need is certainty. The SNP members don't want to give us certainty, they just want to give us assertions. And after last week's shambolic showing from the Scottish Government, we desperately need that certainty. Thank you.
Many thanks. I now call on Jackson Carlo. A generous 6 minutes, Mr. Carlo.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Can I begin actually with agreeing with the way in which Nicola Sturgeon opened the debate by saying that she had hoped we would be having a broader debate this afternoon. I'm sure that opportunity will come. But the events of last week, I think, made it inevitable that we would have the debate this afternoon that we did. And I have to say to the Scottish National Party, by their conduct this afternoon, they give the impression that the events last week constitute an episode about which SNP members seem to be proud. Not frustrated, not angry, not in any way embarrassed, but proud of the confusion they themselves created. And a lot of this has hung around the legal advice, the existence, the nature and everything in it. And I asked the Deputy First Minister, and I want to be clear about this, because these codes are drafted very carefully. The fact that legal advice has or has not been given to the Scottish Government by the law officers, and the content of any legal advice given them by them or anyone else, must not be revealed. The fact that legal advice has or has not been given, not whether or not the Government sought legal advice. Not just now. In his letter to Ruth Davidson today, Frank Mulholland says the same thing. In light of recent discussion on these matters, I would wish to place on record my view that it is extremely important that the long-standing convention against disclosure of the fact or content of law officers' legal advice should be maintained, not whether the legal advice was sought. And therefore, when the First Minister was asked by Andrew Neil in the television interview whether or not legal advice was sought, the programme wasn't seen for the first time last week. It was seen months ago. And nobody really expressed any surprise. When the First Minister went on and said he couldn't say what the legal advice was, he was absolutely and perfectly correct. But he was not breaching any code to say that he had asked for it. In the same way that we all knew that Tony Blair had asked for legal advice on whether or not the Iraq war was legal, but he couldn't reveal what the legal advice was. And the defence last week of the First Minister, I'm not accepting interventions. We've only had Ruth and myself, so I'll persevere. When the First Minister was hiding behind the Deputy First Minister, or sending out Jamie Hepburn or the long-suffering Stuart Maxwell, or in fact, the question they put, the proposition they put was that the First Minister was unable to get this across because Andrew Neil kept interrupting him. Now, forgive me. The First Minister celebrates 25 years as an elected politician today. We know with his imperial ambitions, this is indeed his silver jubilee. Thanks to his natural modesty, we have been spared the balcony appearance, the tea towels and the mugs. But quite frankly, the idea that the Paisley Grammar School boy Andrew Neil mugged the inexperienced First Minister such that he couldn't get his point across on a television programme is by far the most preposterous assertion that this government made last week. Of course he could have got his point across, but worse than that, he then went on, later when it was discovered that he knew he had said he had sought this legal advice, to use taxpayers' money to cover this fact up. And that, I think, is what is completely and totally unacceptable. A fair-minded person, Deputy First Minister, will conclude that the First Minister was either bluffing, or he was incompetent, or that there was something more malicious. Now, I'm happy to accept whichever of those three it is, and frankly, I don't think it is malicious. I think he was bluffing, and I think the government's covering up of this has been wholly and totally incompetent. Now, in the rest of the debate, we had extraordinary interventions from Jamie Hepburn, supported by Stuart McMillan and Bob Doris on Trident. I understood the SNP's policy on Trident was now that they support membership of a NATO alliance which will use which retains the right to use nuclear capability as a first strike resort. That is now their policy. They support an alliance with a nuclear deterrent at its heart. Their only concern is whether or not the submarines sail up and down the Clyde, not the use of nuclear weapons anymore. That's what they've all signed up to. Mr Hepburn had the opportunity to follow his colleagues elsewhere if he didn't believe in the use of Trident, but he has stayed in a party that now does believe in the use of Trident, just so long as it doesn't sail up the Clyde. Annabel Ewing then gave us a great lecture on all these various countries. The point is, we've had the Lisbon Treaty since then. Yeah. And the Lisbon Treaty says that every member must have its own commissioner, that it will have voting rights weighted. In the United Kingdom, we have one commissioner. An independent Scotland would require two. That would require 28 commissioners, and to have an extra commissioner for Scotland requires the unanimous support of all the other member states. That is the situation now, and that is a situation no one in the SNP can guarantee. And that is the point of all of this. It is confused. It would have been far better last week for the First Minister, who I think in 25 years has absorbed the politics of Westminster too much. In Westminster, you can't ever accept that you're wrong. And I think many of us might have hoped that in a Scottish Parliament it would have been different. But no, the First Minister simply couldn't stand up and say, as the Deputy First Minister acknowledged on radio last week, that the impression had been given, the impression had even been encouraged. She acknowledged that an impression had been given that this legal advice had been sought. The First Minister should have said, we apologise for any part we have played in creating that false impression, and we regret using taxpayers' money to try and cover that fact up. You know, what is depressing about this is that we know how votes will go tonight. But at the end of the day, what the First Minister is doing is leading a campaign to encourage the people of Scotland to vote for an independent nation. He is at the head of that campaign. I want to defeat, as a unionist, the SNP on their terms, on the basis of a pro-vote for the union, not on whether or not people actually make a judgment in that referendum, on whether they trust the First Minister who is leading that campaign. But in years to come, when we look back on the result, if this referendum is lost by the SNP and independence is defeated, they will have to think carefully, because their cheers this afternoon will echo back at them. Because one of the reasons they will have lost is because people last week made a decision about the integrity and the trust of the person leading this campaign, and they found it wanting.
Thank you very much. I now call on Nicola Sturgeon, a generous 8 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I would like to begin, as is customary when summing up a debate, by saying it's been a good debate. Sadly, I don't think it has been a particularly good debate. In particular, some of the contributions of Labour members, including, and perhaps in particular, some of the contributions made from a sedentary position, have been completely outrageous and unacceptable. And Labour's conduct of this debate today has confirmed my view that this debate, from Labour's perspective, is nothing more than a fig leaf to cover the inadequacies of Joanne Lamont at First Minister's questions last Thursday. That's the purpose of this debate, and she knows it. Let me deal with a number of the issues that have been raised in the debate, Presiding Officer. Firstly, we've heard from Willie Rennie, Joanne Lamont and others in the debate that the First Minister should have been here taking part in this debate. Members might be interested to know that the First Minister is this afternoon delivering a major speech to the renewables industry, outlining an ambitious new green power target for Scotland, before meeting representatives of the Freshlink company in Glasgow to discuss its plans for the future, something of profound interest and significance to the people whose livelihoods depend on that company. In other words, Presiding Officer, the First Minister is working on behalf of the people of Scotland. That's exactly what he should be doing and exactly what he will continue to do. Secondly, Presiding Officer, I want to address, as I did in my opening remarks, the so-called alleged contradictions between the statements made by myself and by the First Minister. Now, I
accept it regretfully, but I do accept it, that it is in the vested interest of opposition parties not to accept any reasonable explanation this government gives on any issue. After all of us, Presiding Officer, saw that Sunday newspaper article this week, an article entitled Target Salmond, that revealed that the strategy of these opposition parties in the referendum campaign will be to smear the First Minister. Well, I'm happy to let the people of Scotland draw their own conclusions, because just as Labour's scaremongering was defeated in 2007 and 2011, so will their smear tactics be defeated in the referendum in 2014. So I accept, Presiding Officer, I accept the vested interests of these opposition parties. But what I think is outrageous is the way in which this afternoon they appear to have completely ignored the terms of the non-political Lord Advocate's letter to Ruth Davidson issued today. I don't think that is acceptable. Thirdly, Presiding Officer, I want to turn to the Convention enshrined in the Ministerial Code that ministers don't reveal the fact or the content of advice from law officers. Let me read the terms of section 2.35 of the Code. The fact that legal advice has or has not been given to the Scottish Government by the law officers and the content of any legal advice given by them or anyone else must not be revealed out with the Scottish Government without the law officers' prior consent. And in response to the amateur, and I should stress the word amateur, theatrics of Jackie Baillie earlier on, all she had to do was read the official report of my statement last week when I said that the Government had not sought specific legal advice, full stop. That was the answer to Jackie Baillie's question. If she had any interest in the answer, she would have checked it in advance. But, you know, at the heart of the proposition put forward today by Jackie Baillie and by others is that we should say when we don't have law officers' advice. Now, Presiding Officer, even a child could work out that if ministers said when they didn't have such advice, by definition they would also be confirming when they do have such advice. It is a ludicrous proposition. And so too is I think Jackie Baillie had her chance earlier on today. So too is the proposition and the distinction that I'm coming on to the Tory proposition and distinction that Jackson Carlaw is seeking to make. Because clearly if ministers have sought legal advice, the law officers will provide that legal advice. Therefore, to reveal that legal advice has been sought from the law officers reveals the fact of such advice and would put us in breach of that ministerial code. These propositions from the opposition are ludicrous, and the proof that they are ludicrous is that we know the previous UK Labour government thought so too. That's why they went to court in the case of HM Treasury versus the Information Commissioner to uphold that convention. Incidentally, that was over an issue that arose when one Gordon Brown was Chancellor of the Exchequer. But, Presiding Officer, the next item I want to look at is oversight of the Ministerial Code. We've had this afternoon a call from some on Labour's benches for a judicial inquiry. I only paused to ask how much that would cost the taxpayer. We then had another Labour call for a different kind of inquiry. But do you know what is clear from all of this? And it is deeply, deeply disturbing. Labour have clearly calculated that just in case the outcome of the independent inquiry, that their MEP called for, doesn't suit their circumstances, like the last 5 didn't suit their circumstances, they better just discredit the process in advance. It is absolutely disgraceful and absolutely outrageous. And what is so amusing, if it wasn't so serious, Presiding Officer, is that the current model of oversight of the Ministerial Code is one that was called for by Labour in a motion proposed in this chamber on the 28th of February 2008 by, wait for it, one Jackie Baillie. That's the model of oversight of the Ministerial Code that they now disgracefully seek to discredit. Presiding Officer, let me lastly turn to the substantive issue. because many members in this debate have talked about the importance of evidence over assertion, and on behalf of this government, let me accept our responsibility to set out our case fully and clearly. We will do that. But let me also say this, presiding officer, that responsibility falls on the opposition parties too. So let's have some evidence from the opposition. Let's have any evidence at all to back up their ridiculous claim that Scotland, with the abundance of resources that many other European nations, including Spain, rely on, would not be welcomed in the European Union as an independent nation. Let's have any evidence that the cogent, authoritative position set out so well by Aileen MacLeod on Euro membership is anything other than completely accurate. And to Willie Rennie, who seems to want accuracy from everybody else, let me tell you, Sweden does not have a derogation on the euro. Sweden did not join the exchange rate mechanism for the obligatory required 2 years. That's why they're not in the euro. Mary Scanlon's point went on to this ground as well. One of the conditions is voluntary membership of the European exchange rate mechanism. So let us accept our responsibility, but let the opposition parties rise to that challenge as well. Presiding officer, I am happy, I'm very happy indeed, to leave the opposition parties, the Better Together Labour, Tory, Liberal alliance, to wallow as much as they wish in issues of process and in desperate personal smears and attacks, because I believe that reveals better than anything their paucity of vision and ideas. We will continue to put forward the positive case for the independence of our country, and I believe that is the argument that will win the day in 2014.
Many thanks. I would just remind members, before we move to a closing speech from Patricia Ferguson, that interventions from a sedentary position have never been welcomed in this chamber, and nor are they welcome today, and indeed in the future. Patricia Ferguson, until 5 o'clock, please.
Thank you, presiding officer. In 2 years' time, the people of Scotland will be asked to vote in a referendum on our country's constitutional future. There will never have been a more important question posed in our lifetime. The future shape of our society and the direction of our economy will be directly affected by the decision made on that day. The basis of that decision must be informed debate across a wide range of serious issues. Clarity and transparency are necessary prerequisites if our constituents are to play a full part. Nothing less will do. Our national conversation must be firmly rooted in evidence, not subject simply to the loudest declaration of mere unsubstantiated assertion. Unhappily, the contradictory comments of the First Minister and his deputy on the matter of legal advice on an independent Scotland's membership of the European Union is an example of how not to conduct such weighty business. The First Minister, in attempting to explain his behaviour on the legal advice over EU membership that never was, has at best made his deputy and himself appear ridiculous, and at worst has opened them to the charge of indulging in duplicitous behaviour. Either way, Mr Salmond has irrevocably damaged his reputation and, much more seriously, tarnished the office of First Minister. Mr Salmond's inability to admit to mistakes is not strength. It is a weakness. Now let me offer him the advice of Dennis Healey, a real political heavyweight, who remarked, "It's a very good thing to follow the first law of holes. If you're in one, stop digging." It is a law the First Minister should resolve never to break again. Of course, the First Minister could have made clear that his response to Andrew Neil was a slip. Instead, he ducked and dived and bobbed and weaved, and then, when he could no longer dodge the issue, sent his deputy, Nicola Sturgeon, into the ring to take the punishment.
Absolutely.
It was not an edifying performance. And unfortunately, what we've heard from SNP backbenchers during the debate today has been little better. A weak imitation of their master's voice. And that is truly unfortunate. The people of Scotland deserve more than the faithful reaffirming their belief in Mr Salmon's inexhaustible self-regard. What the people of Scotland require from their First Minister, and indeed all elected representatives, is transparency and a frank discussion of the issues. And that is why today's debate matters. The First Minister must clear up the confusion he alone has created.
Absolutely.
Now, the debate today has been, frankly, like a curate's egg, good in parts. And I think that Ruth Davidson made a very interesting point at the beginning of today's debate. Well, I'm sorry if the members of the SNP don't want to be fair-minded and listen to a point that is worth reminding them about, and that is that Ruth Davidson commented on the appalling waste of money that is the court case that the SNP government has taken forward to try to hide the fact that they have a piece of paper that has nothing on it. And I'm afraid that Aileen MacLeod has made the case for us today, because the debate is about the conditions under which Scotland might be a member of the EU, not about quoting treaties that, frankly, have in some cases been overtaken and in others actually apply to members of the EU and not to states that might be acceding to membership. And therein lies the problem, because we will have legal advice about what the status of an independent Scotland in Europe might be, but we need to test that advice because it will not be consistent, and that is why the scrutiny of this Parliament is so important. Now, Jamie Hepburn drew attention to our colleague Catherine Styler's request to the First Minister to refer himself under the ministerial code. But Catherine actually went further than that, because she made the point that, in her view, the ministerial code may have been broken. But she also asked whether an investigation could also consider whether there had been a clear abuse of power and position. Facts, matters that will not be considered under the set-up that the First Minister has put in place. And Hugh Henry and Jackie Bailey are absolutely right to distinguish the type of legal advice which the First Minister and Deputy First Minister have referred to. The ministerial code is actually very clear. So it's just a shame that the First Minister has chosen to twist the terms of the code before running to hide behind his own selective quotations.
Absolutely.
And Lewis MacDonald is absolutely right to remind us that the First Minister could have asked for permission to disclose that he had sought legal advice or not, as we find out the case now is, and he could have done that months ago. He chose not to. And I have to say to Christina McKelvey that on the issue of the likely status of an independent Scotland in Europe, why was it that members of her committee refused the opportunity to have an inquiry into just such that matter? And if she is telling me from a sedentary position that that was not actually what happened at the committee, perhaps, no, I've listened to enough. I will now finish. I will finish. I'd be happy to take Ms McKelvey when I finish my point. I'd be happy to take Ms McKelvey when I have finished my point. Thank you. The point I was going to make to Ms McKelvey, who, by the way, was not in a position to take interventions herself, but the point I would like to make point I would like to make to her is that I have actually now written to her, as she will know, and I have asked her to undertake such an inquiry. So if the opportunity had not previously arisen, it has now. Are you going to take it?
Christina McKelvey.
Thanks very much for taking that intervention. You have nothing to say. That's why I didn't take an intervention from any of you, actually. Anyway. Let's talk about the European Committee inquiry. The European Committee inquiry on the white paper, when it comes out, is on the agenda. That is already published, so maybe you should look at your facts before that. And I had to read your letter in the Daily Mail before I seen it, Miss Ferguson.
Patricia Ferguson.
Well, perhaps Ms McKelvey should be more assiduous in checking her correspondence. Because I can assure Ms McKelvey that copies were sent to both herself and the clerk of the committee before they went anywhere else. Now, my colleague Paul Martin is right to draw attention to the inadequacies of the review the First Minister has put in place. And I have to say that the swaggering way in which the First Minister described his record of victories to Bernard Ponsonby last Thursday was particularly unedifying. Some humility, I think, was called for in those circumstances, but I suppose that was too much to expect. Willie Rennie's assessment of the Edinburgh Agreement is, of course, absolutely correct. The fact of the matter is that Willie Rennie's assessment is absolutely correct, because the agreement is only about the Section 30 order and not about any negotiated settlement that would have to follow a yes vote in the referendum. That is something that would take years following a referendum, and something in which we have yet to hear the points that the SNP government would want to discuss with the rest of the UK, other than, of course, their headlines of wanting to keep the Queen and the pound. And Jackson Carlaw is also correct. Yes, absolutely. I seem to remember that Mr Swinney was very fond of Mr Carlaw and his colleagues' approbation in previous terms. And of course, as the SNP are fast finding out, constitutional politics does that. It makes you have to ally yourself in some issues with people who normally you wouldn't have a great deal in common with. But as I was about to say, Jackson Carlaw is correct to say that the First Minister could have cleared up this whole sorry issue quite some time ago. He could have done it very easily, and he could have avoided all of this farrago. Presiding Officer, the people of Scotland demand clarity and transparency so that they can weigh the evidence when the SNP puts forward its case in support of separation. Issues such as public sector pensions, the division of the UK's liabilities and assets, currency options available to a separate Scotland, fiscal policy and taxation require scrutiny based on the facts, on actual evidence. And Mr Salmon's habit of stating a fiction loudly and at length, hoping it will provide an adequate substitute for fact, will not do. The farrago we have witnessed...
wind up now, please.
I'm winding up, thank you, Presiding Officer. The farrago we have witnessed on the question of EU membership must not be repeated. The First Minister must come clean. We have already heard today from Joanne Lamont that Labour believes that a full judicial inquiry and nothing else will do. That, Presiding Officer, has been borne out not just by the events of the last week, but by the way in which the debate has been conducted on the benches of the SNP. Thank you.
That concludes this debate on the future of Scotland. We now move to decision time. There are 4 questions to be put as a result of today's business. I would wish to remind members that in relation to today's debate on the future of Scotland, If the amendment in the name of Nicola Sturgeon is agreed, the amendment in the name of Ruth Davidson falls. The first question is amendment number 4594.3 in the name of Nicola Sturgeon, which seeks to amend motion number 4594 in the name of Joanne Lamont on the future of Scotland be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. The Parliament is not agreed, therefore we'll move to a vote. Members should cast their votes now. On amendment number 4594.3 in the name of Nicola Sturgeon is as follows. Yes, 62. No, 51. There were 3 abstentions. The amendment is therefore agreed to. And the amendment in the name of Ruth Davidson falls. The next question is amendment number 4594.2 in the name of Willie Rennie, which seeks to amend motion number 4594 in the name of Joanne Lamont and the future of Scotland be agreed to. Are we all agreed? No. The Parliament is not agreed, therefore we'll move to a vote. Members should cast their votes now. On amendment number 4594.2 in the name of Willie Rennie is as follows. Yes, 51. No, 62. There were 3 abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed to. The next question is that motion number 4594 in the name of Joanne Lamont as amended on the future of Scotland be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. The Parliament is not agreed, therefore we'll move to a vote. Members should cast their votes now. The result of the vote on motion number 4594 as amended in the name of Joanne Lamont is as follows. Yes, 62. No, 53. There was 1 abstention and the motion as amended is therefore agreed to. That concludes decision time. We now move on to members' business. Members who leave the chamber should now do so quietly.